Hello everyone, in today's video I will be narrating stories that I found off of Reddit. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But without further ado,
let's get straight into these stories.
I've never been one to believe in the supernatural. I always assumed the stories people tell are just exaggerated accounts of real-life creepiness. That changed last week. I work part-time at a small, family-owned antique shop in my town. It's not a glamorous job, but I like the quiet, and the old items have a charm I've grown fond of. The shop is tucked into a corner of a cobblestone street that sees very little foot traffic, especially after dark. Last Friday, my boss, Mrs. Hartley, asked if I could close up. She had a family emergency and promised me a nice bonus if I stayed late. It seemed simple enough. Lock the doors, check the register, turn off the lights. I'd done it before, so I didn't think twice. The trouble started around 9 p.m., just as I was finishing the final sweep of the store. The bell above the door jingled. I froze because I had locked it an hour earlier. "Sorry, we're closed." I called out, my voice wobbling. No reply. I stepped out from behind the counter to see who had entered, but the store was empty. The door was shut, locked just as I'd left it. The bell swayed gently, as though someone had passed through, but no one was there. I laughed nervously to myself and chalked it up to my imagination. This place was old. Maybe the door wasn't as secure as I thought. I double-checked the lock and went back to tidying. Then came the whispers. At first, I thought it was the old grandfather clock in the corner. It ticks loudly, and its groaning mechanism has spooked me before. But this wasn't ticking. It was a soft, raspy whisper like someone murmuring just below their breath. I followed the sound through the maze of shelves, past dusty books and porcelain dolls. It led me to the far back of the store, where Mrs. Hartley kept the older, rare items. The whisper stopped as soon as I reached the section. I turned to leave when a loud crash shattered the silence. A gilded mirror had fallen off the wall, landing face up on the floor. Its glass was intact, but my reflection wasn't. In the mirror, I saw myself, pale and wide-eyed, but there was something behind me, a figure cloaked in shadow, standing just over my shoulder. I spun around, heart pounding, but no one was there. I didn't wait to investigate further. I grabbed my bag, left the mess for the morning, and bolted for the door. As I fumbled with the keys, I heard it again, a whisper clear as day this time. "Don't leave me. I've never locked a door faster in my life." The next morning, I told Mrs. Hartley about what happened. She laughed it off, saying the shop had a history of odd occurrences but nothing harmful. That didn't comfort me. I quit on the spot. A week later, I was walking past the store when I noticed something that stopped me cold. In the display window, among the vintage knickknacks and antique furniture, was the gilded mirror. After seeing the shadowy figure in the window, I started avoiding that street altogether. The antique shop wasn't far from where I lived, but I found excuses to take longer routes just to avoid it. A small price to pay for peace of mind, I thought, but the unease didn't stop. It began with my dreams. Every night, I'd find myself back in the store. The aisles stretched endlessly, shelves bending and twisting in impossible ways. No matter how far I walked, I'd always end up in front of the mirror. The reflection wasn't mine, though. It was its. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the whisper still echoing in my ears. "Don't leave me." One morning, after another restless night, I found something waiting for me on my doorstep, a small, ornate box. I didn't own anything like it, and the way it was wrapped, perfectly tied with a thin black ribbon, made it clear this wasn't some random delivery mistake. Against my better judgment, I brought it inside. The box smelled faintly of lavender and dust, like the antique shop. Inside was a bundle of old photographs, the kind you'd find in a flea market. They were faded, edges curled, but the faces were disturbingly clear. At first, I didn't recognize anyone in the photos, just solemn-faced people in old-fashioned clothing, posing stiffly for the camera. But then I saw it. The shadowy figure. It was in the background of every photo. Sometimes it stood at a doorway, other times in a window. In one picture, it loomed directly behind a family seated for a portrait. I flipped through the images faster and faster, my heart racing. The last photo stopped me cold. It was May. I was standing in the antique shop, behind the counter, just like I had a week ago. But the shadow wasn't behind me, it was beside me, its hand resting on my shoulder like we were old friends. I threw the box across the room, scattering the photographs everywhere. My breathing was ragged, my hands shaking. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but what would I say? That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't even try. I sat in my living room with every light on, clutching a kitchen knife like it would do any good. The hours crawled by, and just as dawn began to creep through the blinds, I heard it again. The whisper. This time, it was different. Closer. "Why did you leave me?" The room turned ice cold. The knife slipped from my trembling hands as I looked toward the source of the voice. The gilded mirror from the shop was propped against my wall. I hadn't brought it here. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't mine. Its eyes were wrong, dull, empty, and black as the void. The shadowy figure stood behind it, and this time, it stepped forward. I don't remember screaming, but my neighbors told me they heard it. When the police arrived, I was curled in a corner, rocking back and forth. The mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces around me. They asked if I wanted to press charges, but against who? What could I say? The mirror was gone when I went back to my apartment. So were the photographs. I've moved since then, far away from that town, from that shop, from anything that could remind me of what happened. But sometimes, in the corner of my eye, I swear I see the shadow. For a while, things were quiet. I kept telling myself it was over. I moved across the country to a new city, changed my phone number, deleted my social media accounts, and even legally changed my name. I wanted nothing left of my old life to track me down, but I guess some things don't care about borders or names. The first sign came a few weeks ago. I was unpacking a box of kitchenware in my new apartment. It was the last box, one I knew I hadn't packed carefully because I'd been in such a rush to leave. I pulled out plates, mugs, a whisk, and then, at the very bottom, an old photograph. It wasn't mine. I recognized it immediately. It was one of the pictures from the box I'd found on my doorstep, the one with the shadowy figure standing in the background. My hand started to shake so badly I dropped it, the photo landing face up on the floor. I thought I'd destroyed everything, burned the photos, smashed the mirror, but here it was. And worse, this time the shadowy figure wasn't standing in the background. It was closer, almost reaching the edge of the frame. I threw the photo in the trash and took the entire bag out to the dumpster that night. I thought it was over. A few days later, my upstairs neighbor knocked on my door. She was a sweet older woman, the type who bakes cookies for new tenants. But today, she wasn't smiling. "Sorry to bother you," she said hesitantly, "but do you have someone staying with you?" "No," I said, confused. "Why?" Her face paled. "I could have sworn I saw someone in your apartment last night. Tall, wearing black. They were standing by your window, just staring out." I felt the blood drain from my face, but I forced a weak smile. "Oh, no, it's just me. Maybe it was a shadow or something." She nodded, clearly unconvinced, and left. That night, I stayed awake again, every light on. I told myself she was mistaken, but deep down, I knew better. The next day, I decided to install security cameras in my apartment. It was an impulsive decision, but I wanted proof. I set one up in the living room, another in the hallway, and the last in my bedroom. I didn't really expect to catch anything. I wish I hadn't. The footage from the first night was mostly uneventful. Me pacing back and forth, sitting on the couch, jumping at every creak of the floorboards. But around 3 a.m., the living room camera picked up movement. A shadow. It wasn't clear at first, just a flicker near the edge of the frame. But then it moved. It stepped into view, tall and thin, its form hazy like smoke. It didn't have a face, just an unsettling blankness where one should be. It stood there for hours, motionless, staring at the bedroom door. My bedroom door. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I called a priest, a psychic, anyone I thought might help. Most of them didn't take me seriously, and the ones who did just gave me vague advice about cleansing my space or protecting my energy. I tried everything they suggested: sage, salt, prayers, even burning candles. Nothing worked. The thing didn't leave. Last night, I reached my breaking point. I packed a bag and decided to leave again, but as I opened the door to leave, I froze. There, propped against the wall in my hallway, was the gilded mirror, the same one I destroyed back at the antique shop. Its surface was cracked, spiderweb fractures splitting across the glass. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't alone. The shadow was there, its hand pressed against the glass as if it were trying to step through. And then, for the first time, it spoke. "You can't run." I don't remember what happened after that. I woke up on the floor, my bag still by the door. The mirror was gone, and I'm writing this from a motel, miles away from my apartment. I know it's only a matter of time before it finds me again. It always does. If you ever come across a gilded mirror in an antique shop, or anywhere, please, for your own sake, walk away. A few years ago, I worked as a freelance photographer, and one of my clients was a quirky artist named Marisol. She painted abstract pieces that were either mesmerizing or unsettling, depending on your perspective. She rented this old attic studio in a historic part of town, a building that had been a boarding house in the late 1800s. The place had character, with creaky wooden floors, arched windows, and beams so low you had to duck in places. It was the kind of spot you'd see in a movie and think, wow, what a cool space. But in person, it felt heavy. Marisol Marisol had hired me to take photos of her latest series for a gallery submission. The first time I walked in, I immediately noticed the odd smell. It wasn't overpowering, but it lingered, a mix of damp wood and something metallic. I chalked it up to the age of the building and didn't think much of it. Marisol was a little eccentric, but she paid well, so I agreed to shoot her work over a couple of afternoons. On the second day, I was alone in the studio while Marisol ran to grab us coffee. The light was dim because the weather had turned gloomy, and the small desk lamp she left on wasn't cutting it. I decided to move the lamp closer to the canvas I was photographing. That's when I heard it, a faint sound like someone whispering. I froze and listened. Nothing, just the sound of rain starting to tap against the windows. I shook it off and went back to work, but a few minutes later, there it was again. This time, it was clearer, though I still couldn't make out the words. It wasn't coming from the windows or the hallway. It was coming from the floor. I knelt down, pressing my ear to the wood. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a faint scraping sound, like fingernails dragging against a chalkboard, but muffled. My stomach turned, and I shot to my feet just as Marisol walked back in, coffee in hand. "You okay?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. I didn't want to sound paranoid, so I just nodded and mumbled something about the storm making weird noises. She seemed satisfied and went back to work on a canvas in the corner. As the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere grew heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Every so often, I'd catch Marisol glancing over her shoulder like she'd heard something too. Finally, as I was packing up my gear, I decided to ask her about it. "Hey, do you ever hear strange things in her?" She paused, her paintbrush hovering mid-air. "What kind of strange things?" "Like whispering or scraping." Her face went pale. She set the brush down and gave a nervous laugh. "Oh, that's just the building settling. It's old. Creaks and groans all the time," and her words didn't match the way her hands were trembling. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the sounds in my head, trying to rationalize them. The next morning, I got a text from Marisol. "Hey, can we reschedule?" Something came up. I didn't hear from her for weeks after that. When she finally reached out, it was to ask if I still had the photos. She wanted to submit them to the gallery because she wasn't going back to the studio. She wouldn't say why, and I didn't push her. I sent her the files and decided to drop the whole thing. A few months later, I ran into another artist who used to rent a space in the same building. I casually mentioned Marisol's studio, and his face darkened. "You didn't hear," he said. "They found a hidden crawl space under the floorboards in that attic. The police think it was used to hide people or bodies. The one knows for sure." After hearing that chilly revelation from the other artist, I couldn't get it out of my head. The crawl space under the floorboards, used for what exactly? I wanted to forget about it, but every time I closed my eyes, I could hear those whispers again. I told myself it was just my imagination and old building making weird noises. That's all it was, right? A few days later, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to drive past the building just to see if it was still in use. When I got there, the place was eerily quiet. A for-lease sign hung crookedly in one of the lower windows. The attic lights were off, but my mind filled in the memory of the dim glow from Marisol's desk lamp. I almost drove away, but something made me park and get out. Standing in front of the building, I felt an overwhelming sense of unease, the kind that makes your skin crawl and your instincts scream at you to leave. But instead of listening, I walked up the steps and peered through the window on the main floor. The interior looked abandoned, with dust covering the wooden floors and debris scattered around. There was no sign of anyone, but I swear I could feel eyes on me. I backed away quickly, heart pounding, and almost tripped on the cracked pavement. As I turned to leave, I noticed a faint outline of what looked like a child's handprint smudged on the glass. It was too high up to belong to an actual child. I told myself it had to be some kind of prank, leftovers from when the place was still occupied. But deep down, I knew better. That night, I had the worst dream of my life. I was back in the studio, standing over the spot where I'd heard the whispering. In the dream, the floorboards were loose, and I could see a dark gap underneath. As I bent down to look closer, cold, pale hands shot out and grabbed my wrists, pulling me toward the opening. I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. The next day, I got a text from Marisol. It was strange because we hadn't spoken since I sent her the photos. Her message was short and cryptic: "Stay away from the building. It knows you." I stared at my phone, heart racing. I texted her back, demanding an explanation, but she didn't reply. I tried calling, but it went straight to voicemail. The whole thing felt like a bad joke, but her warning stuck with me. A week later, I heard through the grapevine that the building was slated for demolition. Apparently, the owners had decided it wasn't worth the hassle of trying to rake it out anymore. I felt a twisted sense of relief, safe, thinking maybe whatever was in there would finally be gone for good. The night before the demolition, I had another dream. This time, I was outside the building, watching as a wrecking ball swung into the attic. The walls crumbled, revealing not just the crawl space, but something worse. There were faces, pale, sunken faces, pressed against the inside of the walls, mouths open in silent screams. They weren't just in the crawl space, they were part of the building. I woke up gasping, my chest tight with terror. The next day, I checked the news, hoping to see an article about the demolition, but there was nothing. I searched online, but the only mention of the building was a small forum post from someone who claimed they'd heard whispers coming from the rubble after it had been torn down. I've tried to move on, but sometimes, late at night, I think I hear the whispering again. It's faint, like it's coming from the floor beneath me. I tell myself it's just my imagination. I keep telling myself that, but I don't think I really believe it. The whispers didn't stop after that night. They weren't constant, but every now and then, in the dead of night, I'd hear them soft and unintelligible, almost like they were coming from somewhere far away. I told myself it was nothing, old pipes, a draft, or maybe just the echoes of my overactive imagination. But the more I ignored it, the more persistent it became. One evening, I came home to find my bedroom door ajar. I live alone, and I was certain I'd shut it that morning. My heart started pounding as I slowly pushed the door open. Everything seemed normal at first glance. My bed was made, my things were exactly where I left them. But when I turned to leave, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. There was a smudge on the inside of my window, a faint handprint, almost identical to the one I'd seen on the glass at the building. My apartment is on the 3rd floor. There's no fire escape, no balcony, no way someone could have reached the window from outside. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows made me jump. I thought about calling someone, a friend, the police, anyone, but what would I say? Hey, I think I'm being haunted by a whispering attic. I'd sound insane. The next day, I decided to dig deeper into the building's history. I spent hours scouring local archives and old newspapers. What I found made my blood run cold. In the late 1800 seconds, the building had been a boarding house, just as I'd heard. But what I didn't know was that it had a dark reputation. Several tenants had gone missing over the years, their disappearances never solved. One article mentioned rumors of a secret space beneath the attic, where some believed the landlord had hidden the bodies. The story didn't end there. Decades later, the building was turned into an art studio. Multiple artists complained of hearing strange noises, whispers, footsteps, even the sound of breathing when no one else was around. One artist, a sculptor, reported finding small, childlike handprints pressed into the wet clay of her unfinished work. She moved out the next day. I felt sick reading this. It was as if the building had absorbed all the fear and pain of those who had disappeared, and now it seemed to have followed me. That night, I was determined to stay awake. I sat on my couch, every light in the apartment blazing, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. Around 3 a.m., the whispers started again. This time, they were louder, more distinct. I couldn't make out the words, but they were closer, almost like they were coming from just behind the walls. Then, the scraping began. It sounded like nails dragging across wood, coming from the floor under my feet. My heart felt like it would burst out of my chest. I grabbed my phone, ready to call someone, anyone, but before I could dial, the lights flickered and went out. The whispers stopped. The apartment was silent, oppressively silent. I sat there in the darkness, phone clenched in my hand, too terrified to move. And then I felt it, a cold, gentle breath against the back of my neck. I ran out of the apartment without looking back. I didn't care that I was barefoot or that it was the middle of the night. I just kept running until I reached my car. I drove to a friend's house and spent the night on their couch, shaking and unable to explain what had happened. I moved out the next week. I didn't go back for most of my things. I couldn't bring myself to step foot in that apartment again. I've tried to start over, to put it all behind me. I used to run track and cross country, so training runs were part of my routine. Our town had a bike path that ran for miles, cutting through the outskirts and dipping into an older, industrial area. It wasn't the safest part of town, but it was broad daylight, and I was with my friend Jesse. We figured we'd be fine. The path eventually narrowed into a tunnel that passed under an old overpass. It wasn't particularly long, but it always gave me a weird feeling, like I was being watched. The walls were covered in graffiti, and sometimes you'd see broken glass or beer bottles. People joked it was a hobo hangout, but I'd never seen anyone there before. That day, Jesse and I reached the tunnel just as the wind picked up and clouds rolled in, making it a bit darker than usual. I slowed down, instinctively cautious, but Jessie rolled her eyes. "It's just a tunnel," she said, jogging ahead. I followed her in, the sound of our shoes echoing in the confined space. Halfway through, I heard it, a sharp scrape, like metal on concrete. It wasn't us, we were moving too smoothly. They stopped. Jessie stopped too, turning back to me. "What?" she asked, irritated. "Did you hear that?" it? I whispered. We both stood still, and then we heard it again, this time louder. Scrape, dragon, scrape, dragon. It came from deeper in the tunnel, from the shadows we hadn't yet reached. Jessie's confidence faltered. Probably just a squirrel or something, she muttered, but I could tell she didn't believe it. I stepped forward cautiously, my heart pounding. Jessie stayed behind me, gripping my arm. As we moved closer, the sound stopped. Silent. All I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. Then, out of nowhere, a voice. Low, raspy, and sing-song. Don't stop now. You're almost here. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. Jessie let out a small scream and started pulling me backward, but I couldn't move. The voice came again, louder this time, so close. My eyes adjusted to the dark, and I saw him. A man crouched against the wall, almost blending into the graffiti. He was filthy, his clothes hanging off him in rags, and his head was cocked at an unnatural angle. He held a long metal pipe, the end of it jagged and rusted. He smiled at me, a grin too wide to be human. Rud, Jessie screamed, yanking me so hard that I stumbled. The man stood up in one fluid motion, taller than I expected, and took a step toward us. I didn't need to be told twice. We bolted out of the tunnel, sprinting back the way we came. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear him running after us, his heavy footsteps pounding on the concrete. He was fast, faster than anyone should have been. We didn't stop until we were back in the open, where other runners and cyclists were passing by. Only then did I look back. The tunnel was empty. We told the police, but they didn't find anyone. The officer who took our statement said there had been reports of someone harassing people on the bike path, but nothing this extreme. I never ran there again. Jessie moved away a year later, and we don't talk about it anymore. For weeks after the incident, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every creak in my house, every shadow outside my window made my heart race. My parents brushed it off as paranoia, and maybe they were right, but Jessie and I both knew what we'd seen and heard wasn't normal. About a month later, Jessie called me out of the blue. She sounded panicked, her words spilling out so quickly I could barely understand her. I swear it's him. Slow down. I said, my stomach tightening. What do you mean? I'm staying with my cousin for the weekend, she said, her voice trembling. We were walking to the corner store, and I saw him. He was just standing there at the edge of the parking lot, staring at me. I didn't know what to say. The idea that this man had somehow found Jessie miles from where we'd seen him was too much to process. Did it do anything? I asked. No, but she cut herself off. I just know it was him. That smell. I can't forget it. I tried to calm her down, but honestly, I wasn't sure what to believe. Was it possible he'd followed her, or was her mind playing tricks on her like mine had been doing? The next day, I got a text from Jessie. He was outside my cousin's house last night. I'm going home early. I called her immediately, but she didn't pick up. That was the last I heard from her for weeks. When I finally got through, she was distant, brushing off my questions and saying everything was fine, but I could tell it wasn't. Meanwhile, strange things started happening to me too. It started small. Footsteps behind me when I walked home from school, though no one was there when I turned around. My dog, Max, would growl at the window at night, staring at something I couldn't see. Once, I found the back gate to our yard wide open, though I was sure I'd locked it. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of tapping on my bedroom window. It was faint, like fingernails on glass. My heart leapt into my throat. My bedroom was on the second floor. I stayed frozen in bed, too scared to move. The tapping stopped, and I thought maybe I'd imagined it, but then I heard it, a voice, low and raspy, coming from outside. Don't stop now. You're almost here. My blood ran cold. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. I grabbed my phone and called the police, whispering to the operator what was happening. They said they'd send someone, but by the time the officers arrived, there was no sign of anyone outside. No footprints in the dirt below my window. Nothing. The police didn't take me seriously. They chalked it up to a prank or a bad dream. My parents didn't believe me either, but I knew. It was him. Jessie and I eventually drifted apart, but I heard through mutual friends that she moved states not long after high school. I can't say I blame her. As for me, I stopped running. I stopped going anywhere alone, and I never ever walked by tunnels. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear it, the faint sound of tapping, followed by that voice. Years passed, but the fear never fully went away. I moved to a different town for college, started a new life, and did my best to bury the memories. Jessie and I lost touch entirely, and I convinced myself that whatever happened back then was over. For a while, it worked. I even started running again, sticking to well-lit parks and avoiding anything that felt remotely isolated. But the paranoia never never left me completely. I always carried pepper spray, kept my earbuds out, and made sure someone knew where I was going. Then, during my junior year of college, it happened again. It was late autumn, and the days were getting shorter. I had an evening class that ran until 7 p.m., and by the time I walked out of the building, it was already dark. The campus was mostly empty, but I figured it wasn't a big deal. I made the walk back to my dorm 100 times before. I was about halfway there when I noticed something. It sounded faint at first, like distant footsteps, but as I kept walking, it grew louder. It wasn't steady, though. It had that same uneven rhythm I'd heard all those years ago. Scrape, dragon, scrape, dragon. I froze in place, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Slowly, I turned around. At first, I didn't see anything, just the empty sidewalk and the faint glow of a street lamp in the distance. But then I spotted him. He was standing at the edge of the light, half hidden in shadow, his head tilted at that unnatural angle. His grin was the same, too wide and too eager, and in his hand was something long and metallic, a pipe, or maybe a crowbar. I couldn't tell. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. He took a step forward, the scrape of his weapon on the pavement echoing in the quiet. "Don't stop now," he rasped, his voice cutting through the cold night air. "You're almost here." That snapped me out of it. I turned and bolted, running faster than I ever had in my life. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My dorm was only a few blocks away, and I prayed I'd make it before he caught up to me. When I reached the building, I slammed the door shut behind me and collapsed against it, gasping for air. The security guard at the front desk stared at me, alarmed, but I couldn't explain what had happened. My mind was spinning, my body trembling. I finally managed to choke out, "There's a man outside." The guard grabbed a flashlight and went to check, but of course, by the time he got there, the man was gone. I stayed locked in my room for the rest of the night, shaky with fear and trying to make sense of it all. But the worst part, the next morning, when I finally worked up the courage to leave my room, I found something waiting for me. On the floor outside my door was a piece of paper. It had one word scrawled across it in shaky, uneven letters: soon. I moved out of that dorm by the end of the week, transferring to a different campus across the state. I changed my number, deleted my social media, and made sure no one could find me. I work part-time at an aquatic center, mostly handling maintenance shifts after hours. It's a quiet gig, and honestly, I enjoy the solitude. The pool after dark has this calm, echoey vibe that feels like being inside a giant seashell. One night, I was doing my usual rounds when I noticed something odd. The water level in the main pool was lower than usual. Nothing drastic, maybe an inch or two, but it was noticeable. It didn't make sense since the pumps and filters had been fine earlier. I figured it was just a glitch and went to check the filtration room. That's when I saw it. At the bottom of the pool, where the main drain usually is, was a staircase. It spiraled down into what looked like complete darkness. I froze, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing. There had never been stairs there before. I'd cleaned this pool countless times. I knew every tile, every crack. Against my better judgment, I leaned over the edge to get a closer look. The water rippled faintly, almost as if something was moving down there. I told myself it was just the pool's filtration system kicking on, but my gut was screaming that it wasn't. I radioed my coworker, Mark, who was in the office. When I described what I was seeing, he laughed and told me to stop messing around. "Stairs in the pool." "Yeah, okay, buddy," he said. Frustrated, I decided to prove it to them. I grabbed a flashlight and dipped it into the water. The beam barely penetrated the darkness below the staircase. I couldn't see the bottom. My curiosity got the better of me, and I grabbed the pool's long net pole. I poked it toward the stairs, and the moment it touched them, I swear I felt a pull, like something was trying to yank the pole out of my hands. I dropped the pole and stumbled back. The water turned, and I could hear it sloshing even though I wasn't touching it anymore. Then I heard a sound I'll never forget, a low, guttural groan, like metal grinding against metal, but alive. It reverberated through the whole pool area. I bolted to the office and dragged Mark out to sea. Of course, by the time we got back, the water was completely still. No stairs, no strange noises, just the usual main drain, sitting there like nothing had ever happened. Mark gave me endless grief about it, calling me paranoid and tired, but I knew what I saw. I refused to work another night shift after that. A week later, I quit altogether. It's been a couple of months since I left that job, but the dreams haven't stopped. They're getting worse. At first, it was just me staring down at the staircase. Now, in the dreams, I'm standing on the stairs. The water feels thick and heavy, like I'm wading through syrup, but I'm always moving down, step by step. I never see the bottom, but I know something is waiting for me there. I tried to brush it off as my imagination running wild, but last week, I woke up with my feet soaking wet. My bedroom was dry, and there was no explanation. skeleton. My shoes, socks, everything was bone dry too. Just my feet, soaked to the skin. That's when I started digging. I needed answers. I looked up the aquatic center's history and found something unsettling. Decades ago, before it became a pool, the building was part of a larger facility, a hospital to be exact. Specifically, it was a mental institution with a reputation for less than ethical practices. The pool area had been part of the basement where the institution kept its most difficult patients. I couldn't find many details, but I did come across an old newspaper article about a massive flood that destroyed part of the hospital. The basement was completely submerged, and several patients and staff were never found. The article mentioned a structural anomaly in the floor that might have contributed to the collapse, but it was vague. It stuck with me, though. What kind of anomaly could cause a flood like that? Despite my fear, I had to go back to the pool. Not officially, I wasn't about to ask for my old job back. Instead, I decided to sneak in after hours. It wasn't hard, the security system was outdated, and I still remembered the codes. The place was eerily quiet at night, just like I remembered. The smell of chlorine hung in the air, and my footsteps echoed across the tile. I made my way to the maid pool, heart pounding. It looked normal, calm, still water reflecting the dim emergency lights. For a moment, I thought I was crazy. Then I saw the ripples. They started in the center of the pool, faint at first but growing stronger. The staircase appeared again, slowly materializing out of the darkness below. My breath caught in my throat. This time, it wasn't empty. Something was coming up the stairs. I couldn't make out its shape, but I could hear it. The same grinding, guttural sound from before, but louder, angrier. The water swirled violently, splashing onto the deck as whatever it was climbed higher. I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air in the parking lot. When I looked back, the building was completely dark, like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to come back. That was 2 nights ago. I haven't told anyone, not even my family, who would believe me, but I think it knows where I live. Last night, I woke up to the sound of dripping water. My bedroom floor was soaked, and there were wet footprints leading from my bed to the door. They weren't mine. They were too big, and they were still wet. I didn't sleep last night. Every sound, every creak of the house made my skin crawl. I barricaded the door to my bedroom with a chair and stayed up with the lights on. I kept telling myself it wasn't real, that it was some lingering nightmare or hallucination. But the soaked footprints were real. The water on the floor was real. Whatever was in the pool had followed me home. Today, I decided to call Mark. He might have thought I was messing around before, but I needed him to believe me now. I was shaking when I dialed his number, rehearsing how I'd explain everything without sounding insane. But when he picked up, I barely got 2 words out before he interrupted me. "Dude," he said, his voice tense. "I was going to call you. Something weird is happening at the pool." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "There was an accident last night," Mark said. "A lifeguard stayed late to finish up some paperwork. The cameras showed him going into the pool area around midnight, but ... he never came out. I felt like the floor had been yanked out from under me." "Did they find him?" "Sort of." Mark hesitated. "The morning crew found his shoes and clothes near the edge of the pool. No sign of him, though. They drained the pool this morning to look for him, but what? There was no water in the pool." Mark whispered, "No, just the staircase. And they don't go down there. No one does." My hands were trembling so badly I nearly dropped the phone. "Mark, listen to me. You have to get out of there. Whatever is down there, it's not safe. It's not just a pool, it's, I don't know, some kind of gateway. Mark sounded skeptical, but there was fear in his voice, too. "Look, man, I don't know what's going on, but I'm not sticking around to find out. I already gave my notice this morning." "Good," I said. "Stay away from that place. Promise me." He promised, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Not for me. Not for anyone who had been there. Whatever was beneath the pool wasn't going to stay contained. That night, the dreams came back, but this time they were different. I wasn't alone. I saw the lifeguard, his face pale and distorted, standing at the bottom of the stairs. His eyes were wide with terror, and his mouth moved like he was trying to scream, but no sound came out. Behind him, the shadows twisted and writhed, forming something massive. Something with too many arms. When I woke up, I could still hear the faint echoes of splashing water. My window was open, and the smell of chlorine filled the room. This morning, I checked the news. The aquatic center is closed indefinitely due to structural concerns. No mention of the lifeguard. No mention of the staircase. It's like they're trying to erase it, pretend it never happened. But I know better. The staircase is still there, waiting. And I have this horrible feeling that it's not done with me. Every time I close my eyes, I see it. The water, the stairs, the thing lurking in the darkness. I don't know how to stop it. I don't even know if it can be stopped. All I know is that if it comes for me, I'll do whatever it takes to keep it from finding anyone else. I was driving across the country to visit my family for the holidays. It was late at night, around 11:30 p.m., and I was somewhere in the middle of Nebraska on a desolate stretch of the interstate. There were no cars, no streetlights, just me, the road, and an unsettling amount of darkness. I was getting drowsy, and my GPS told me there was a rest stop coming up. I figured I'd pull in, use the bathroom, and maybe grab a few minutes of sleep in my car. As I approached, I noticed how isolated it was. The rest stop sat slightly off the interstate, surrounded by flat fields that seemed to stretch forever. A single flickering light over the parking lot greeted me as I pulled in. The place looked run down but not abandoned. There were a couple of cars parked in the lot, though I didn't see anyone around. I parked near the building and made my way inside. The restroom area was dimly lit and smelled like damp concrete. I was alone, or so I thought. I was washing my hands when I heard faint humming coming from one of the stalls. It was soft, almost melodic, and definitely unsettling. I hadn't noticed anyone else come in, and the place had been dead quiet when I entered. "Hello," I called out, trying to mask the nervous shake in my voice. The humming stopped. I waited for a reply, but none came. I dried my hands quickly and turned to leave when I noticed something that froze me in place. There was a pair of shoes visible under one of the stall doors. Men's shoes, old and scuffed, but they were facing the wrong way. The toes were pointed toward the toilet, as if whoever was in there was standing on it, watching me. My heart started pounding. I debated just running out of there, but something compelled me to glance back one more time. That's when I saw the shoes slide, not step, not shuffle, slide slowly across the floor toward the gap under the door. I bolted out of the bathroom and ran straight to my car, locking the doors behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I struggled to start the engine. As I fumbled with the keys, I noticed something in my rearview mirror. A figure was standing just outside the restroom building, partially obscured by the flickering light. They weren't moving, just standing there, staring at my direction. I couldn't make out any features, but something about their posture, too rigid, too unnatural, made my skin crawl. I finally got the car started and sped out of there without looking back. For the rest of my drive, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every now and then, I'd glance at my mirrors, half expecting to see that figure again. I've told this story a few times, and some people think I imagined it or let my nerves get the better of me, but I knew what I saw. I've avoided rest stops ever since and always make sure to keep driving, no matter how tired I get. For years, I thought I could put that experience behind me. I told myself it was just a creepy encounter, something I could chalk up to exhaustion or paranoia. But a few weeks ago, something happened that made me realize I might never escape whatever I encountered that night. It started with an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Rest Stop Memories." I almost deleted it, thinking it was spam, but curiosity got the better of me. The email was short, just one sentence. "Do you remember the shoes?" My stomach dropped. I hadn't told anyone about the shoes. Not the way they slid across the floor, not the way they were facing. I only ever mentioned the figure outside, the weird humming, and the unease I felt. My fingers hovered over my keyboard, but I couldn't bring myself to reply. I marked it as spam and tried to brush it off. The next few days, things started to get strange. At night, I'd hear faint humming outside my apartment. It wasn't constant, just a few notes, barely audible. Every time I got up to look out the window, the street would be empty. Then, one night, I woke up to a faint tapping sound. It wasn't on the front door or the windows, it was coming from my bathroom. My heart started racing as memories of that rest stop flooded back. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, hesitating before opening the bathroom door. The room was empty, but the mirror was fogged up as if someone had been in there, breathing heavily. In there, in the condensation, was a single word. "Why?" I backed out of the bathroom, my phone trembling in my hand. My mind raced. Why what? Why did I leave? Why didn't I stay? I didn't have answers, but one thing was clear, I wasn't imagining this. I decided to stay with a friend for a few nights, but the humming followed me there. The final straw came a week later when I found a pair of old, scuffed men's shoes on my kitchen floor. They were facing the wrong way. I packed a bag that night and drove to a motel hours away. As I sat in the room, trying to think of what to do next, I realized something that sent a fresh wave of dread through me. The shoes weren't there when I left my apartment. Who, or whatever, was tormenting me wasn't just leaving ominous signs. It had been in the car, with me. I don't know how to make it stop, or if it ever will. All I know is that every time I hear that faint humming or see a shadow move where it shouldn't, my heart skips a beat. And every time I close my eyes, I wonder if they'll be there when I open them. I couldn't just live like that, waiting for the next shoe to drop, literally and figuratively. figuratively. I needed answers. After another sleepless night in the motel, I decided to go back to where it all started, the rest stop. The thought made my skin crawl, but I felt like I didn't have a choice. Whatever this thing was, it clearly wasn't going to leave me alone until I faced it. I planned the trip carefully. I packed supplies, flashlights, a crowbar, even salt. I made sure to leave during the day and picked up a friend, Greg, who had a knack for debunking paranormal stuff. He thought the whole thing sounded like a bad dream, but he agreed to come along for the ride. By the time we arrived at the rest stop, it was dusk. The place looked just as eerie as I remembered, maybe worse. The flickery light in the parking lot was still there, as if it hadn't been fixed in years. Greg, always the skeptic, shrugged. Creepy vibe, sure, but you're probably just tired. Let's check it out. We walked inside, and the air immediately felt heavy, like the building itself was holding its breath. The restroom was still dimly lit, the same damp smell lingering in the air. I half expected to hear humming the moment we stepped in, but it was silent. Too silent. Greg went to inspect the stalls while I stood near the sinks, heart pounding. There's nothing here, man, he called out. His voice echoed unnaturally, as if the room was larger than it should have been. Lebio. He stopped mid-sentence. Greg, I called out, my voice shaking. No response. I walked toward the stalls, gripping the crowbar in my hand. The door to the last stall was slightly ajar, and I could see Greg's feet inside, motionless. Greg, this isn't funny, I said, my throat tightening. I pushed the door open, and my stomach turned. Greg was standing on the toilet, his back to me, his head tilted at an impossible angle. His arms hung limply at his sides, and his body twitched like a marionette controlled by an unseen hand. Before I could react, a low, guttural humming filled the room. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Greg turned slowly to face me, his eyes wide but lifeless. His mouth opened, and in a voice that wasn't his, he whispered, "You shouldn't have come back." I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the crowbar. Greg, or whatever was controlling him, stepped down from the toilet, his movements jerky and unnatural. I turned to run, but the bathroom door slammed shut on its own. The lights flickered, and the humming grew louder, almost deafening. Shadows stretched across the walls, twisting and writhing like living things. I screamed for Greg, but his body convulsed and collapsed to the floor. The shadows seemed to pull him toward the last stall, where they swallowed him whole. I don't remember how I got out of there. One moment I was in the restroom, and the next I was in my car, speeding down the interstate. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel steady. Greg was gone. I tried calling his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. When I went to the police, they didn't believe me. They said the rest stop had been abandoned for years and no one had reported seeing another car there in a long time. The nightmares haven't stopped. Sometimes I hear Greg's voice in my dreams, calling for help. Sometimes I hear the humming, soft but insistent, as if it's trying to draw me back. I know I'll never go back to that rest stop again. This happened about 5 years ago when I was visiting a traveling fairground with my younger sister, Ellie. We were in a smaller town at the time, the kind of place where events like this are a big deal. The fair had the usual attractions, bumper cars, fried food stands, and a slightly sketchy looking Ferris wheel. Ellie wanted to try everything, and since she was only 12 at the time, I kept a close eye on her. As the evening wore on, Ellie begged me to check out the maze of mirrors. I was hesitant. It looked like one of those cheap, tacky setups, but she wouldn't stop pestering me. I gave in and bought 2 tickets. The attraction was tucked into the back corner of the fair, away from the brighter rides and noisy games. The lights were dimmer here, and I noticed that not many people were lining up. The guy at the entrance, who I assumed was the operator, barely glanced at us as he took our tickets. He was tall, almost too tall, and his eyes didn't quite focus on anything as he muttered something about finding the exit. The moment we stepped inside, I knew something was off. The air was stale, and the mirrors were smudged with what looked like handprints and streaks of something darker. Ellie was giggling, running ahead, but I stayed close. The reflections distorted us, twisting our faces and bodies into strange, grotesque shapes. At first, it was funny, then it wasn't. Lily turned a corner, and I lost sight of her. I called her name, but the maze was disorienting, with every mirror reflecting me a dozen times over. The echoes made it hard to pinpoint where her voice was coming from. Lily, stop messing around, I shouted, trying to sound calm. Then I saw her, sort of. Her reflection was in one of the mirrors, her back to me. I sighed in relief and walked toward her, but something wasn't right. The way she was standing, completely still, didn't seem like her. She wasn't giggling anymore. Ellie, I asked, my voice shaky. She didn't respond, but her reflection moved. It turned to face me, but it wasn't Ellie. The figure had her clothes, her hair, but the face was wrong. It was smiling, way too wide, and the eyes were too big, almost bulging out of its head. I froze, unsure if it was some kind of warped reflection or a trick of the light. Then it raised a hand and waved at me. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. Behind me, I heard Ellie's actual voice. She was calling for me, her voice panicked. "I'm here," I shouted, spinning around to follow her voice. But every time I turned a corner, I ended up back at the same mirror, staring at the not Ellie, who was now grinning ear to ear. Its lips moved, but the sound didn't match. It whispered something I couldn't make out, and then it started tapping on the glass. From the inside, at that moment, Ellie burst out of another corridor, tears streaming down her face. She grabbed my hand, and we ran. I don't know how we found the exit, but when we did, the operator was gone, and so were most of the fairgoers. We didn't talk much on the drive home. Ellie refused to go to any fairgrounds after that, and honestly, I don't blame her. For a while after that night, Ellie and I tried to put the experience behind us. She told me she barely remembered what happened inside the maze, just that she got lost and panicked. I didn't push her for details. It felt easier to pretend it was just a weird, one-time scare, but things didn't feel right at home. The first incident happened a week later. I was getting ready for bed, brushing my teeth in front of the bathroom mirror when I saw it. A handprint smeared faintly in the fog glass. It wasn't from me. I hadn't touched the mirror. The hand was smaller, like Ellie's, but it wasn't her. She'd already gone to bed. I told myself it was nothing. I cleaned the mirror and didn't mention it to anyone, but the next night, I noticed something else. My reflection wasn't quite in sync. It was subtle, barely noticeable at first. When I reached for my toothbrush, my reflection's hand hesitated just a fraction of a second too long before moving. I stared at it, unblinking, until I convinced myself I was overtired and imagining things. Ellie started acting strange, too. She'd been having nightmares, waking up crying and saying she'd seen the other me in her dreams. I'd hear her whispering to herself in her room, and when I'd ask who she was talking to, she'd just shrug and say, "No one." She avoided mirrors altogether, even covering the one in her room with a blanket. One night, about 3 weeks after the fair, things escalated. I was sitting in the living room, scrolling on my phone, when I heard Ellie scream from her bedroom. I bolted upstairs and found her curled up on her bed, staring at her covered mirror. She was here, she sobbed, pointing at the blanket. She was in the mirror, but she wasn't me. I tried to calm her down, telling her it was just a bad dream, but deep down, I felt sick. I pulled the blanket off the mirror, half expecting to see something, but it was just us, just my reflection holding Ellie, both of us pale and shaken. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about our reflections looked off. That night, I stayed in Ellie's room. She fell asleep eventually, but I couldn't. Around 3 a.m., I caught movement in the mirror out of the corner of my eye. I turned to look, and my blood ran cold. There were 2 Ellies in the reflection. One was sleeping peacefully in her bed, just like the real Ellie, but the other Ellie was standing behind me in the reflection, her head tilted slightly, her lips curled into that same too wide grin I'd seen in the maze. I didn't move. I didn't dare blink. The second Ellie stared at me, her grin widening as she slowly raised a hand to tap on the glass. Tap, tap, tap. I grabbed a blanket and threw it over the mirror, my heart pounding. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I told Ellie we needed to get rid of the mirror. She didn't argue. We took it out to the backyard and smashed it with a hammer. I hoped that would be the end of it, but I still feel like I'm being watched sometimes, like there's another version of me just waiting for the right moment. The worst part, a few days ago, Ellie showed me something she found under her bed, a shard of the broken mirror. I don't know how it got there. I threw it away immediately. A couple of days after Ellie found the shard, I started noticing it again, that eerie feeling of being watched. At first, it was subtle. I'd catch glimpses of movement in the bathroom mirror or in the reflection of the TV when it was turned off. Always fleeting, like the kind of thing you could convince yourself was just a trick of the light. But the more it happened, the harder it was to ignore. Then one night, it got worse. Ellie and I were eating dinner in the living room, watching some mindless reality show to distract ourselves. Everything felt almost normal for the first time in weeks, but as I glanced at the dark window behind the TV, my stomach dropped. There, in the reflection, I saw us. Except it wasn't us. The reflected version of me was staring directly at the window, not at the TV. And Ellie, she wasn't moving at all, just sitting there, her head slightly tilted, her mouth stretched into that same awful grin. I turned to look at her, panicked, but she was fine, happily munching on her food, completely oblivious. I turned back to the window. The reflection hadn't changed. Ellie, I said slowly, trying to keep my voice calm. Don't look at the window. Just get up. Go to your room. She frowned at me, confused. What? Why? Just go. My voice cracked, and she finally listened, hurrying upstairs. The moment she was out of sight, I grabbed the nearest blanket and threw it over the window, covering the reflection. My heart was racing, and I had no idea what to do. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about the reflection, how it seemed separate from us, like it had its own awareness. I decided to do some research, hoping to find an explanation, something to make sense of this madness. I scoured the internet, reading about everything from urban legends to paranormal phenomena. Most of it felt like nonsense, but then I stumbled across an old forum post that made my blood run cold. The user described an experience eerily similar to mine, a visit to a traveling fairground, a strange maze of mirrors and unsettling encounters with distorted reflections afterward. The post ended with a warning, "Don't let them out." I couldn't sleep after reading that. What did it mean? Let who out? The reflections? Were they trying to escape? And if so, how? The answer came the next evening. Ellie and I were in our room, packing up anything with a reflective surface, mirrors, picture frames, even her tablet. I was determined to eliminate anything that could act as a window to whatever was stalking us. Suddenly, Ellie froze, staring at the small vanity mirror we'd overlooked. "She's here," Ellie whispered, her voice trembling. "She's watching." I turned to the mirror, and there she was, Ellie's reflection, but not quite. Her eyes were too wide, and her movements didn't match Ellie's at all. She raised a hand and pressed it against the glass. Then, slowly, the hand started to push through. "Rud," I screamed, grabbing Ellie's arm and yanking her out of the room. As we bolted down the hallway, I heard the sound of glass cracking and splintering behind us, followed by a faint, sickening giggle. We ran outside, not stopping until we were in the middle of the yard. I turned to look back at the house, half expecting to see something in the windows, but everything looked normal. Too normal. "What do we do?" Ellie whispered, clutching my arm. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we couldn't go back inside. Not until I figured out how to stop this. It's been 3 days. Ellie and I are staying at a motel for now, but I can't shake the feeling that we didn't leave it behind. Last night, I caught a glimpse of something in the motel bathroom mirror, a face, not mine, smiling at me. I think smashing the mirrors made it worse. It's not just confined to one reflection anymore. It's everywhere now. Windows, water, even the faint shine of polished surfaces. They're getting closer, and now Ellie's acting strange again. She's been whispering to herself the way she did before, but this time, when I asked who she was talking to, she didn't shrug it off. I worked part-time at a small, run-down mill in my town. Most of the shops were closing, and only a handful of stores were still open. My job was at a family-owned stationery shop on the first floor, tucked away in a corner. It was usually dead quiet after 7 p.m., which is when my shift would end. One night, my boss asked me to stay late to help organize some old inventory. I didn't mind. I needed the hours. Around 9 p.m., I realized I hadn't seen anyone walk past the store in almost an hour. The silence felt heavier than usual. I decided to take the trash out to the mall's dumpsters, which were located in the basement. This was a section of the mall most customers didn't even know existed. The elevator that led there was ancient and grown with every floor it passed. When the elevator doors opened, I was greeted by the dim glow of flickering fluorescent lights. The basement smelled damp, and the walls were lined with old posters advertising stores that hadn't been in the mall for decades. The dumpsters were in a wide, open area just outside a pair of heavy double doors that led to a maintenance corridor. I dragged the trash bag over to the dumpster and tossed it in. As I turned to leave, I heard a faint scraping sound coming from the maintenance doors. I froze. It sounded like metal dragging against concrete. I told myself it was probably just a janitor or something and quickly headed back toward the elevator. Before I could press the button, I heard the scraping sound again, closer this time. It wasn't my imagination. It was rhythmic, like someone deliberately dragging something heavy. I turned around and stared at the double doors. One of them was slightly ajar now, though I could have sworn both were closed when I came down. I felt a cold sweat break out on my neck. Then I saw it. A pale, bony hand slowly slid through the gap in the door, followed by another. Whoever or whatever it was crawling. The hands were elongated, with fingers that looked unnaturally long. My instincts kicked in, and I jammed the elevator button repeatedly. The scraping turned into a faster, erratic clattering as the thing started pulling itself out of the doorway. I didn't stick around to get a better look. As soon as the elevator doors opened, I jumped inside and hit the button for the first floor. I could hear the sound of something dragging itself across the floor as the doors closed. My heart was racing, and when the elevator finally reached the top, I bolted out and locked up the store as fast as I could. I quit the next day. I didn't even go back for my paycheck. I don't know what was in that basement, and I don't want to know. After quitting, I did my best to forget about the whole experience. I told myself it was probably some maintenance worker pulling a prank or a trick of the light. You know, anything to make it seem less terrifying. But deep down, I knew better. A few weeks after I quit, I ran into a former coworker, Amber, at a coffee shop. She still worked at the mall but was planning to leave soon. I tried to keep the conversation light, but eventually she brought up the basement. "You ever notice anything weird down there?" she asked, her tone casual, but her eyes betraying unease. I froze. "What do you mean by weird?" Amber hesitated, then leaned in closer. "I had to close up alone the other night, and I went down to the basement to toss the trash. While I was down there, I swear I heard someone whispering my name, though when I looked around, no one was there." My stomach churned. I wanted to tell her everything but held back. Probably just her imagination. I said said weakly. Amber nodded, but she didn't seem convinced. Maybe. Still, I've been avoiding that place since. It just feels wrong down there. We said our goodbyes, and I left feeling even more unsettled. Amber's story confirmed what I had been trying to ignore. There was something wrong with that basement. A month later, I heard that the mall had shut down completely. I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief because no one else would have to deal with that basement. Dread because I wondered what they did with it. Did they seal it off? Did they check it out? Did they find anything? For a while, it was easy to put out of my mind. The mall faded from local memory like all dying malls do. But then, a year after it closed, I stumbled across a news article that stopped me cold. The article was about the mall's demolition. Construction crews had discovered something strange while tearing it down, a hidden room connected to the basement maintenance area. According to the report, the room contained old equipment, what looked like a makeshift living space, and bones, human bones. The article was vague about specifics, but it mentioned that investigators believed the remains were decades old. The most disturbing detail, there were scratch marks all over the walls and floors, as if someone or something had tried desperately to escape. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the sound of that scrapey metal and the sight of those pale, unnatural hands. Whatever I saw that night wasn't just some prank or figment of my imagination. Sometimes, I wonder if the demolition really got rid of whatever was down there. What if it just moved, found somewhere new to hide? And sometimes, late at night, I still hear that sound, the faint, rhythmic scraping of metal against concrete. I hope it's just in my head. After reading that article, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't done with whatever had been in that basement. It lingered at the back of my mind, an itch I couldn't scratch. Weeks turned into months, and I started convincing myself it was over. Maybe I had just let my imagination get the better of me. Then, one night, I was driving home late from a friend's house. It was a quiet stretch of road, no other cars around, and my headlights barely cut through the dense fog that had rolled in. I almost missed it at first, a figure standing on the side of the road. It was hunched over, its back to me, barely visible in the mist. My stomach twisted, but I told myself it was probably just some hitchhiker or someone walking home. As I got closer, I slowed down out of instinct, trying to get a better look. That's when it turned around. It wasn't human. The thing was gone, with pale, almost translucent skin stretched tightly over its face. Its eyes were hollow, deep black pits that seemed to suck the light from my headlights. And those hands, those long, bony fingers, I recognized them immediately. I slammed on the gas, my heart pounding as I sped past it. In my rearview mirror, I saw it start to move, dragging itself onto the road, its limbs jerking unnaturally as it tried to follow me. I didn't dare slow down. My car roared as I pushed it to its limit, the thing disappearing into the fog behind me. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window and sat in the corner of my room, shaking. I wanted to believe I'd imagined it, but deep down, I knew the truth. It had found me. The days after that were strange. I started noticing things, small but unsettling. Footsteps outside my window at night, scratches on the siding of my house that hadn't been there before. Once, I found my front door unlocked even though I was sure I'd bolted it. And then came the whispers. It started as a faint sound I could barely hear, like wind rushing through the trees. But over time, the whispers grew louder. They came at night, calling my name with a raspy, broken voice. Sometimes it sounded like it was just outside my bedroom door. Other times, it seemed to come from inside the house. I thought about calling the police, but what would I tell them? That some pale, skeletal thing from an abandoned mall was haunting me. I knew how crazy it would sound. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. Armed with a flashlight and a baseball bat, I decided to search the house. I checked every room, every closet, under every bed. Nothing. But as I stood in the hallway, I felt it, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I wasn't alone. The air grew heavy, and the whispers started again, louder this time. They weren't coming from inside the house. They were coming from beneath it. I live in an old house with a crawl space. I'd never been down there before, but at that moment, I knew I didn't have a choice. My hands were shaking as I pulled open the hatch. The whispers grew louder, almost frantic, as I aimed my flashlight into the darkness. At first, I didn't see anything, just dirt and cobwebs. But then, in the far corner, I saw them, handprints in the dirt. They were too large, too elongated to be human. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement, something pale and thin retreating into the shadows. I slammed the hatch shut and didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The whispers didn't stop. They've never stopped. I'm writing this now because I don't know what else to do. It's been weeks, and the thing is getting bolder. I see it out at the corner of my eye, standing at the edge of the woods behind my house. I hear it scraping against my walls at night, trying to get in. I don't think it's going to stop until it gets what it wants, and I have no idea what that is. This happened a few years ago, and I still can't explain what I experienced. My friends and I were in high school, and one weekend, we decided to explore the old amusement park on the outskirts of town. It had been shut down for decades, ever since a freak accident on one of the rides. Everyone in town said it was cursed, but we just thought it was an exciting, creepy place to explore. We snuck in after dark, armed with flashlights and the confidence only teenagers have. The place was eerie, rusted rides creaked in the wind, faded clown faces leered from peeling murals, and weeds had overtaken what used to be a bustling carnival. At first, it was just harmless fun. We dared each other to climb onto the old Ferris wheel, poked around the decaying ticket booths, and laughed at how spooky the place felt. But then, things started to feel off. It began when we found the carousel. It was in surprisingly good shape compared to the rest of the park. The horses were dusty but intact, their painted eyes glossy and too lifelike. One of my friends, Chris, dared me to sit on one of the horses for a picture. As soon as I climbed on, I swear I heard a faint tune, like a music box, coming from the carousel, but the others swore they didn't hear anything. I laughed it off, but I couldn't shake the unease that settled over me. We moved on to the funhouse, which had partially collapsed but was still standing enough for us to venture inside. That's when things took a darker turn. As we navigated the maze of warped mirrors, our flashlights began to flicker. We joked that it was just bad batteries, but when all four of our lights went out simultaneously, the joking stopped. We stood there in total darkness, the air feeling thick and oppressive. Then, out of nowhere, we heard footsteps. Not ours, and not the soft shuffling of an animal. These were deliberate, heavy steps echoing through the funhouse. We froze, listening as the steps grew louder, closer. Someone whispered, "Run." We bolted, tripping over debris and each other in our rush to escape. But no matter how fast we ran, the footsteps seemed to keep pace with us, always just a few feet behind. When we finally burst out of the funhouse and into the open air, we didn't stop. We ran all the way to the fence we climbed earlier and scrambled over it, panting and terrified. Only once we were safely outside did we look back. That's when we saw it. Standing in the doorway of the funhouse was a figure. It was tall and humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong. Its arms were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its glowing eyes reflected the moonlight. We never went back to that park, and we don't talk about that night anymore. Sometimes I wonder if it was just our imaginations running wild, but deep down, I know what I saw was real. After that night, we all tried to move on. None of us talked about what had happened at the amusement park. It was like we had some unspoken agreement to bury it and pretend it never happened. But for me, the nightmares started almost immediately. At first, they were vague, just flashes of the figure standing in the doorway of the funhouse, its glowing eyes boring into me. But over time, the dreams became more vivid. I'd find myself back at the park, wandering alone. The rides would be spinning and moving as if the park was alive, even though it was empty. And then I'd hear the footsteps, always behind me, always getting closer. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The worst dream came about a month after our visit. In it, I was standing in front of the carousel. The music was playing again, louder this time, and the horses were moving on their own, bobbing up and down as if invisible children were riding them. I tried to turn and run, but I couldn't move. My feet were stuck to the ground. That's when I saw it. The figure from the funhouse was sitting on one of the horses, its unnaturally long arms draped over the poles. It wasn't looking at me at first, but then its head snapped toward me in one sudden, jerky motion. Its glowing eyes locked onto mine, and I swear I heard it laugh, a deep, guttural sound that echoed in my ears even after I woke up. After that dream, I couldn't keep quiet anymore. I called Chris, desperate to know if he'd experienced anything similar. He was reluctant to talk at first, but eventually he admitted that he'd been having nightmares too. So had the others. Chris also told me something I didn't know. The carousel wasn't supposed to be there. According to him, the park never had a carousel when it was opened. He'd asked his dad, who grew up in the area, and he was certain that carousel shouldn't have existed. That's when I decided we needed answers. Against my better judgment, I convinced Chris and one of our other friends, Mia, to go back to the park with me during the day. I told myself it would be less scary in the daylight, that we could investigate without the overwhelming fear we felt that night. When we got there, the park looked just as abandoned as before, but something was different. The carousel, the pristine, creepy carousel, was gone. In its place was an overgrown patch of dirt, like it had never been there at all. Chris looked pale, and Mia kept muttering, "This doesn't make sense. This doesn't make sense." We wandered around for a while, but there was no sign of the carousel. It was like it had vanished. But just as we were about to leave, we heard it, the faint sound of a music box, coming from somewhere deeper in the park. My stomach turned to ice, and we all froze. The sound grew louder, and then the footsteps started again. This time, we didn't wait to see anything. We ran, faster than we'd ever run before, and we didn't stop until we were in the car, speeding away from that cursed place. I tried everything to drown out the nightmares and the memories. White noise machines, therapy, even burning sage around my room. Nothing worked. The music box tuned, and the footsteps became part of my life, creeping into the corners of my mind when I least expected it. But it didn't stop with me. About 3 months after our second trip to the park, Mia disappeared. Her mom called me, frantic, asking if I'd seen her or if I knew where she might have gone. I hadn't spoken to her in weeks, but when her mom mentioned that Mia had been acting strange before she vanished, saying things like I need to go back and stop it, I felt the blood drain from my face. I called Chris immediately, and he sounded just as shaken. "You don't think she went back, do you?" he asked. "She wouldn't," I replied, but even as I said it, I knew I didn't believe myself. Chris and I decided to go to her house to look for clues. In her room, everything seemed normal at first glance, but then we found her journal. The last few entries sent chills down my spine. Entry 1, I can hear the music box during the day now. It's not just in my dreams. Am I going crazy? I swear it's getting louder. Entry 2, I saw the figure today. It was standing at the end of my driveway, just watching me. No one else saw it. I think it's calling me back to the park. Final entry, I have to go back. I think it wants me to. Maybe if I go, it'll leave me alone. Maybe it'll leave all of us alone. They called the police and told them everything, but they didn't take us seriously. To them, Mia was just a troubled teenager who probably ran away. But Chris and I knew better. We decided to go back to the park ourselves, even though every instinct screamed at me to stay away. This time, we brought a crowbar and a flashlight each. We weren't planning to fight anything, we just wanted to bring Mia back. The park was even more decrepit than before, but as we stepped inside, the air felt thick and charged, like a thunderstorm was about to hit. We called out for Mia, our voices echoing in the empty space. That's when the music started again. It was louder now, echoing from somewhere deep in the park. We followed the sound, our flashlights trembling in our hands. When we reached the spot where the carousel used to be, we froze. It was back. The carousel stood there, pristine and spinning slowly, even though there was no one on it. The horses bobbed up and down in time with the haunting tune, and there, sitting on one of the horses, was Mia. Her head hung low, and her hands were gripping the pole tightly. "Mia," I shouted, but she didn't respond. Chris and I ran toward her, but as soon as we stepped closer, the air around the carousel seemed to ripple like a heat wave. The figure appeared again, stepping out from behind one of the horses. It was taller than I remembered, its limbs bending and twisting unnaturally, its glowing eyes bored into us, and I swear I heard that same guttural laugh, louder now, vibrating in my chest. Chris froze, but I kept moving, yelling Mia's name. As I got closer, I realized something was wrong. Her face was blank, her eyes glassy, like she wasn't really there. The figure raised one impossibly long arm, pointing at me. The music grew deafening, and the carousel began spinning faster, the horses blurring into a whirlwind of color. Chris grabbed my arm and yanked me back just as the ground beneath the carousel cracked open. Black smoke poured out, and the figure stepped toward us, its body stretching and distorting as it moved. "We have to go," Chris screamed, dragging me away. I didn't want to leave Mia, but something about the figure, the smoke, the music, it felt like we wouldn't survive if we stayed. We ran. I don't remember how we got out of the park, but when we did, the music stopped abruptly. We turned back, and the park was silent. The carousel, the figure, and Mia, everything was gone. Mia was never found. The police labeled it a runaway case, but Chris and I knew the truth. The park had taken her. Chris moved away a few months later. He said he couldn't stay in a town so close to that place. As for me, I've done my best to move on, but I know the park isn't finished with me. I've been reading this subreddit for a while, but never thought I'd have something to contribute. This happened a few months ago during my graveyard shift at the small regional airport where I work. It still gives me chills every time I think about it. For context, I work security at a mid-sized airport that only runs commercial flights during the day. At night, it's mostly cargo and private flights. My shift starts at 11 p.m. and ends at 7 a.m. By midnight. The terminal is practically deserted, with only a skeleton crew of us patrolling the building. This particular night was no different. Around 2:30 a.m., I was doing my rounds at the terminal. The place was dead silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. The lighting was dim, as they turn off most of the overheads after the last commercial flight departs. It was eerie, sure, but I'm used to it. I was walking past gate 7 when I noticed something odd. A woman was sitting in one of the chairs by the window. She was facing away from me, looking out at the dark tarmac. Her hair was long and unkempt, like she hadn't combed it in days, and she was wearing an outdated flight attendant uniform, something I'd only seen in old airline ads from the 70 seconds. I thought it was strange because I hadn't seen her come in, and no private flights were scheduled until morning. They had been. I called out. She didn't move. I walked closer, trying to keep my voice calm. "Ma'am, the terminal is closed. Can I help you find your way out?" Still, no response. She didn't even flinch. As I got closer, I started to notice. Something wasn't right. Her hair looked almost too black, like ink, and her skin was so pale it almost glowed under the dim emergency lights. But what really got me was her reflection in the window. He wasn't there. I stopped dead in my tracks. My brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the angle, maybe the glass was dirty, but no matter how much I shifted, there was no reflection of her in the window. Just me, standing there like an idiot. Damn, I called again, my voice cracking. This time, she turned her head slowly toward me, and my heart nearly stopped. Her eyes, they weren't eyes. They were just black pits, like someone had hollowed them out. Her mouth twisted into a grin that stretched far too wide. I don't remember running, but the next thing I knew, I was in the security office, slamming the door shut and locking it. My coworker, Danny, was sitting at the desk eating chips. He looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "What's wrong with you?" he asked. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but the words wouldn't come out right. He laughed it off, saying I must have been half asleep. But when I insisted, he humored me and pulled up the security cameras. Here's the thing, the camera for Gate 7 showed me standing there, talking to thin air. No woman, no shadow, nothing. Danny teased me about it for the rest of the night, but I swear on my life, I saw her. I've been working at the airport for 5 years, and nothing like this has ever happened before or since. After that night, things at the airport started to feel different. It wasn't anything obvious, just small things that were easy to brush off at first. My radio would occasionally pick up static, even when I was standing close to the base station. Lights in the terminal would flicker, but only around Gate 7, and sometimes, when I was alone on my rounds, I'd get the distinct feeling that I was being watched. I didn't tell anyone else about it. Danny already thought I was crazy, and I wasn't about to give the rest of the crew any ammunition to joke about. But I started keeping a journal of all the weird things that happened. One night, about 2 weeks after I saw her, I found something in the Gate 7 seating area. It was an old flight manual, the kind pilots used before everything went digital. The thing was battered and yellowed, and it had the logo of an airline I'd never heard of, Skylark Aviation. Furious, I looked it up when I got home, but I couldn't find anything. No records of the airline, no old advertisements, nothing. It was like it had never existed. I brought the manual to work the next night to show Danny. "Where'd you find this?" he asked, flipping through it. Gate 7, I told him. He gave me a weird look. "This thing's ancient. Probably just something a passenger left behind years ago." But that didn't make sense. The terminal gets cleaned top to bottom every night, and this manual looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Still, I didn't argue. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was reading too much into it. That same night, around 3 a.m., the fire alarm went off at the terminal. It wasn't uncommon for the system to glitch, so Danny and I split up to check the building. I headed toward the main concourse, and Danny went to the cargo area. When I got to Gate 7, the alarm was blaring so loudly that it felt like my skull would split. I was about to turn back when I saw her again, the same woman sitting in the exact same spot as before. This time, she was turned toward me, her hollow eyes locked on mine. She wasn't smiling anymore. Her expression was blank, almost sad. "Who are you?" I shouted over the alarm. "What do you want?" She didn't respond. Instead, she slowly raised her arm and pointed toward the window. My heart was pounding as I turned to look, and that's when I saw it, a plane, partially obscured by fog, sitting on the farthest runway. It was old, like something out of a history book, and the Skylark Aviation logo was painted on the tail. The thing that really made my stomach drop was the condition of the plane. It was rusted, corroded, and looked like it had been abandoned for years. The alarm abruptly stopped, plunging the terminal into an eerie silence. When I turned back to the woman, she was gone. I radioed Danny and told him what I'd seen. He thought I was joking, but I convinced him to come out to the tarmac with me. When we got there, the plane was gone. There wasn't even a sign it had been there, no tire marks, no condensation from the fog. Nothing. After that, I decided I couldn't keep this to myself anymore. I asked one of the older employees, Linda, if she'd ever heard of Skylark Aviation. Her face went pale. "Don't talk about that," she said. "It's bad luck." I pressed her for more information, and after some hesitation, she told me about a crash that happened decades ago. A Skylark Aviation flight had gone down shortly after takeoff, killing everyone on board. The wreckage was never recovered, and for years, there were rumors that the flight was cursed. Since Linda told me about the crash, I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. I started digging into old records, hoping to find more information about Skylark Aviation and the crash she mentioned. Unfortunately, it wasn't easy. Skylark seemed to be a ghost of an airline. No articles, no official history, nothing. Finally, after weeks of searching, I stumbled upon a thread in an old aviation forum. Someone had posted about ghost flights and mentioned Skylark Aviation Flight 93. According to them, the flight was carrying 74 passengers and 5 crew members when it vanished after departing from the very airport where I work. The official report stated that the wreckage was never recovered and the cause of the crash was labeled as unknown. But what really made my skin crawl were the comments. One user claimed to have worked at the airport years ago and mentioned strange sightings near Gate 7. Another described seeing a phantom plane on the tarmac late at night, just like I had. Someone else mentioned an old legend. The souls of the passengers and crew were still trying to complete their flight, stuck between the living and the dead. I should have stopped there, but my curiosity got the better of me. I decided to do something I regret. The next time I worked the graveyard shift, I brought a small digital recorder with me. I don't know what I was expecting, maybe some static, maybe nothing at all, but I had to try. At around 2:45 a.m., I set up the recorder at Gate 7 and started asking questions. Is anyone here? What happened to Flight 93? Do you need help? I waited in silence, feeling ridiculous, but then I heard it. A faint whisper. It was so quiet I thought I imagined it, but when I played back the recording, it was there, a voice soft and broken, saying, "We're lost." My blood ran cold. I kept listening, and a second voice came through, this one distorted and low. "Help us." I yanked the recorder away like it had burned me. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't move. The air around me felt heavy, oppressive, like I was being watched. That's when I noticed something else. The windows overlooking the tarmac had fogged up, and there were handprints on the glass, handprints from the outside. I bolted. I left the recorder behind and didn't look back until I was safe in the security office. Danny wasn't on shift that night, so I had no one to talk to, no one to confirm I wasn't losing my mind. I spent the rest of my shift watching the monitors, and nothing unusual happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a mistake. The next day, I called in sick. I needed time to process what had happened, but when I finally worked up the courage to check the security logs from that night, the recording was gone. So was the recorder. The airport's been eerily quiet since then. No more flickering lights, no strange smells, no shadows in the corner of my eye. It's almost like they're gone, like whatever was tied to Gate 7 finally found what they were looking for, or someone. I haven't decided if I'll quit yet, but one thing's for sure, I'll never go near Gate 7 again. And if you ever find yourself at a small regional airport late at night, be careful where you wander. You might find more than you bargained for. For context, I was a college student at the time, traveling back to my hometown for the weekend. My bus was scheduled to leave late at night, around 11:45 p.m., from a rarely used terminal on the outskirts of the city. The terminal was ancient and eerily quiet when I arrived, cracked tiles, flickering fluorescent lights, and an unsettling silence that seemed to amplify every tiny sound. There was no one at the ticket counter, just a sign saying, "Tickets can be purchased on the bus." Weird, but whatever. I figured I'd wait by the boarding area until it was time to leave. About 10 minutes in, a man came out of the shadows from behind the vending machines. I hadn't seen or heard an approach, which was odd considering how quiet the place was. He was dressed in outdated clothing, like something straight out of the 1940s, and he held a newspaper folded neatly under his arm. His skin was pale, almost waxy, and his eyes, they didn't seem right. They were too wide, too bright, like they were reflecting light that wasn't there. "Waiting for the Midnight Express?" he asked, his voice strangely formal. I nodded and mumbled something about the bus running late. He smiled, an unsettling, too wide grin, and sat on the bench across from me. For a while, he didn't say anything, just kept staring at me with those unblinking eyes. I tried to focus on my phone, but the Wi-Fi was spotty, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me. "Not many people take this route anymore," he said suddenly. "It's not safe. You know, things happen on this road." I didn't respond, just shifted uncomfortably in my seat. The terminal was so empty that even the sound of a distant vending machine dropping a soda felt deafening. I was desperate for someone else to show up, anyone, but no one came yet. Then, the man pulled out the newspaper he'd been carrying and unfolded it slowly. It looked ancient, yellow with age. He held it out to me, and I reluctantly took it. The headline said that chilled down my spine, "Bus crash leaves 18 dead in freak accident." The date on the paper was from decades ago. I looked up to ask him where he'd gotten it, but he was gone. I mean, completely gone. No footsteps, no sound of a door creaking open, just vanished. I told myself I was imagining things, that maybe he'd gone to the bathroom or something, but I couldn't shake the unease. At 11:45 on the dot, the bus finally pulled in, and I was the only passenger to board. The driver gave me a strange look as I handed him my money, like he wasn't expecting anyone. The ride was uneventful at first. I kept thinking about that man in the newspaper. When I looked out the window, though, I noticed something strange. The same landmarks kept repeating: an old diner, a rusted out billboard, a lone street lamp flickering in the dark. At first, I thought I was just tired, but after the third time seeing the same diner, I knew something was wrong. I approached the driver and asked him him why we weren't making progress. He didn't answer at first, just kept staring straight ahead. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and almost mechanical. "This route doesn't go anywhere." I stumbled back to my seat, my heart racing. The landmarks outside the window had stopped repeating. Instead, the road was lined with shadowy figures standing perfectly still, their faces obscure. They all turned to look at the bus as we passed, their heads moving in eerie unison. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed with fear, but eventually I must have blacked out. When I woke up, I was sitting on a bench outside the terminal, the morning sun shining down on me. The bus was gone, the terminal was locked up, and my luggage was nowhere to be found. To this day, I have no idea what happened that night. I tried looking up the accident from the newspaper, but I couldn't find any record of it. Sometimes I wonder if I dreamed the whole thing, until I remember the driver's chilling words, "This route doesn't go anywhere." After waking up on the bench, I tried to piece everything together. My phone was still in my pocket, but it was dead, no battery left, though I had charged it fully before heading to the terminal. I glanced around the deserted parking lot, hoping someone would show up, but it was as empty as the night before. Eventually, I decided to walk. The city was only a few miles away, and the sun made everything feel less threatening. I tried to convince myself that maybe I had just dozed off waiting for the bus and dreamed everything else. That seemed plausible enough, even if the dream had been unnervingly vivid. When I got back to campus, my first priority was to charge my phone and figure out what had happened to my belongings. As soon as the phone turned on, it started blowing up with missed calls and texts. The first text I saw froze my blood, from my mom, sent at 2:03 a.m. "Are you okay? I just saw something horrible on the news about a bus crash." There were others, from friends and family, asking if I was safe, asking why I wasn't answering, asking why my location had disappeared from our shared tracking app. Confused, I googled bus crash near. The first result made my stomach drop. Fatal bus accident on Old Mill Road, 20 dead, 1 missing. I clicked on the article, scanning it in disbelief. The crash had occurred the same night I was at the terminal, involving the exact route I was supposed to take. The article described how the bus had veered off a cliff on a sharp turn. Most of the passengers and the driver were declared dead at the scene. One body, however, was never recovered. They listed my name as the missing person. I stared at the screen, unable to process what I was seeing. My heart was pounding, my mouth dry. How could I have been listed as a passenger when I never boarded? Unless I thought back to the man with the newspaper, his pale face, his cryptic warning. Things happen on this road. Had he known what was going to happen? Or had he been something else entirely, something not human? But the worst part wasn't the article, it was the photo included at the bottom. A photo of the crash site, showing the wreckage of the bus in the ravine below. The charred remains of luggage and seats were scattered everywhere, and among them was something that made my blood run cold. It was my backpack, unmistakably mine, sitting among the debris. I didn't tell anyone what had happened that night, not my family, not my friends. I said I missed the bus, lied about leaving my stuff behind at the terminal. I even stopped going home for weekends, opting to stay on campus no matter what. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that man, about his strange smile, his old-fashioned clothes, about how he disappeared without a sound. Weeks turned into months, but I couldn't shake the memory of that night. It felt like a weight I carried everywhere I went. Every time I tried to move on, some small detail would drag me back into the fear. Like the time I walked past a newspaper stand and saw a headline about another accident, eerily similar to mine. Or the late night dreams where I was back on the bus, surrounded by shadowy passengers, the driver's voice echoing, "This route doesn't go anywhere." But the strangest part came about 6 months later. I'd started taking evening classes to fill my time and avoid any unnecessary travel. One night, as I was leaving campus, I noticed a bus idling at the curb near the entrance. It was old, not like the modern city buses, but one of those retro models with faded paint and a cracked destination sign. The display simply read, "Final stop." I told myself it was just a coincidence, maybe a private charter or some vintage collector's project. But as I walked past, the driver leaned out of the window. It was the same man from the terminal. He didn't say anything this time, just gave me that same too-wide grin, his bright eyes locking onto mine. My legs froze, and for a moment, it felt like the world around me had gone silent. No passing cars, no voices, nothing. Then he spoke, his voice clear and cold. "You missed your stop last time. Care to try again?" Panic surged through me, and I bolted in the opposite direction, not stopping until I was safely back in my dorm room. I locked the door, my heart pounding, my chest tight. My phone buzzed in my pocket, startling me. It was a notification from the local transit app, a bus schedule update. The message made my hands shake. New route added, Midnight Express, last stop, Old Mill Road. I deleted the app on the spot. After that, I couldn't sleep properly for weeks. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see the man's face or hear the whispery voices of unseen passengers. I became obsessed with figuring out what had had happened to me. I pored over every article about the crash, visited forums, even looked into local folklore about the road and the terminal. What I found didn't make me feel any better. Apparently, Old Mill Road had a reputation for being cursed. Over the decades, there had been numerous reports of accidents, strange sightings, and disappearances. One story stuck with me. Back in the 1940s, a bus full of passengers disappeared without a trace on that very route. Witnesses claimed they saw the bus driving into the terminal, but it never came out. Some people believe the passengers were still riding, trapped in some kind of loop, forever reliving their last moments. The description of the missing bus matched the one I'd seen that night outside campus. Now, every time I see a bus, any bus, I feel a chill run down my spine. I've stopped using public transportation altogether, relying on rideshares or walking no matter how inconvenient. It's safer that way, at least that's what I tell myself. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I'll hear the distant hum of an engine outside my window. I'll peek through the blinds and see a shadowy bus, its headlights glowing faintly in the dark. My friends and I decided to take a spontaneous trip to a local theme park that was celebrating its off-season by keeping a few attractions open late. The weather was damp, and a light drizzle had scared off most of the crowd, so the place was eerily empty. It was kind of fun at first, no lines, the sound of distant screams from the coasters echoing into the night. There was one ride I had always loved but rarely got to go on because the lines were so long, the old haunted boat ride. You know the type, dimly lit tunnels, animatronic ghosts, cheesy sound effects. My friends were into it, so I decided to go solo while they hit up the nearby roller coaster. When I got to the ride, there was no one else in line. The ride operator, a tired-looking teenage girl, barely looked up from her phone as she waved me toward a rickety boat. The whole thing was a big rundown, but I shrugged it off. It was all part of the charm, right? The boat drifted into the darkness, and the usual animatronic figures popped up, a skeleton here, a ghoul there. It was cheesy, just like I remembered, but as I got further into the tunnel, the atmosphere shifted, the air felt colder, and the fog machines were so thick I could barely see a foot in front of me. That's when I noticed something strange. The animatronics were moving slower than they should have been, almost jerking unnaturally, like their mechanisms were glitching. One figure, a pirate skeleton, turned its head toward me, and for a split second, I could swear its eyes were plastic. They looked wet, human, and I laughed nervously, telling myself I was being ridiculous. But then I heard it. Footsteps, not the click and whir of the ride's machinery, but soft, wet footsteps, like someone barefoot was walking on the damp floor of the tunnel. They seemed to echo all around me, getting closer. I turned to look behind me, but there was nothing there, just the thick fog and the dim glow of flickering lights. The boat suddenly jerked to a stop. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. No response. The footsteps grew louder, and now I could hear something else, faint whispering. It sounded like multiple voices, overlapping, their words indecipherable but urgent. Panic set in as I tried to push the boat forward manually, but it wouldn't budge. The ride had apparently stalled, and I was trapped in the middle of the tunnel. That's when I saw it. A figure emerged from the fog, standing perfectly still on the edge of the water. It wasn't an animatronic, I'm sure of it. It was too tall, too real. Its face was obscured by shadows, but I could make out its arms, which were unnaturally long and ended in claw-like fingers. They tilted its head, as if studying me. The whispers grew louder, and I realized they were coming from it. I couldn't understand the words, but they sounded ancient, wrong. I screamed, kicking at the water to try to get the boat to move. Suddenly, the ride jolted back to life, and the boat surged forward. The figure didn't follow, it just stood there, watching me with that unnatural stillness. When I finally emerged into the open air, the ride operator looked up, startled. "Whoa, are you okay?" she asked, clearly confused by my panicked state. I tried to explain what had happened, but she just frowned and shook her head. "No one else is in there. It's been empty all night." After a week of avoiding the topic, I couldn't shake the feeling that what I saw, or whatever it was, wasn't just a glitchy animatronic or a random hallucination. My dreams were plagued by those whispers, a chorus of unintelligible words that felt closer to a chant. Sometimes, I woke up sweating, convinced I heard faint footsteps in my hallway. Then, about 2 weeks after the theme park trip, I got a message on my phone from an unknown number. The text was simple, "Did you like the ride?" I froze. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Maybe one of my friends was messing with me. I replied with a cautious, "Who is this?" They got no response. After a while, I convinced myself it was just a prank and blocked the number. But things didn't stop there. A few nights later, I was sitting in my living room watching TV when I heard something strange. It was faint at at first, barely noticeable over the sound of the show, but as I turned the volume down, I realized it was unmistakable, those same whispers, low and fragmented, coming from inside my house. I grabbed my phone and stood up, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. It seemed to be coming from the corner of the room, near the window. My curtains were drawn, but the sound was clearer now, words I still couldn't understand but that made my skin crawl. I pulled back the curtain, expecting to find a prankster or maybe some kind of malfunctioning speaker, but there was nothing there, just the empty street outside. The whisper stopped. The next morning, I called one of my friends who had been at the theme park with me. I tried to play it off casually, asking if they had noticed anything weird about the place or heard any strange stories. To my surprise, my friend got quiet. Actually, she said, I didn't want to freak you out, but when we were leaving, I swear I saw someone standing by the entrance to that ride. Like, a really tall guy. He was just standing there, staring at you as we walked by. I figured it was just some weird employee or something, but now, she trailed off, clearly unsettled. That's when I decided to do some digging. I looked up the history of the theme park, trying to find any stories about accidents, hauntings, anything that might explain what happened. And I found something. Years ago, before the haunted boat ride was installed, that part of the park used to house a different attraction, a wax museum. Apparently, it had been shut down after a tragic incident where one of the workers went missing. According to the articles I found, he was last seen in the tunnels beneath the exhibit, which were repurposed when the boat ride was built. Some people claimed the park covered it up, saying he'd run away, but others believed he died down there. The strangest part, witnesses who worked there at the time claimed they heard whispers and footsteps in the tunnels for weeks after he disappeared. Things only got worse after my research. I started noticing little things around my house that didn't feel right. Objects weren't where I left them, and doors I knew I closed would be slightly ajar. At first, I thought I was being paranoid until I started hearing the whispers again. They didn't stay confined to the house. Sometimes, I'd hear them in the grocery store or while walking to my car after work. Always faint, just on the edge of perception, but always the same, those overlapping, incomprehensible voices. No one else seemed to notice. Then one night, I woke up to something that still makes my stomach turn when I think about it. It was around 3 a.m. and the room was dead silent. No whispers, no footsteps, nothing. But something felt off. I turned over in bed, half asleep, and froze. My bedroom window, which I always kept locked, was wide open. I sat up, heart pounding, and looked around the room. My phone was on the nightstand, and I grabbed it, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. The beam of light swept across the room, revealing nothing out of place at first. Then I noticed something on the floor by the window. Larger, small, white footprints led from the window to the foot of my bed. I didn't scream. I didn't move. I just sat there, staring at the tracks, trying to convince myself that I was dreaming. But when I reached out and touched the floor, the water was real, cold, soaking into the carpet. I bolted out of bed and turned on every light in the house, checking every room, every closet, every corner. No one was there. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I called out of work and decided to visit the theme park again, as much as the thought terrified me. I needed answers, closure, something. When I got there, the place looked as run down as ever. A few rides were operating, but the haunted boat ride was closed. A man in a maintenance uniform was standing near the entrance, and I decided to ask him about it. Excuse me, I said, trying to sound casual. What happened to the boat ride? Is it under repair? He looked at me, confused. That ride's been shut down for months. He said, we had some electrical issues and a small fire last year. Haven't reopened it since. My stomach dropped. But I went on it 2 weeks ago, I said, my voice shaking. The man's expression darkened. Impossible, he said. There's no way anyone could have gone on that ride. It's been sealed off. I stumbled away, my mind racing. If the ride wasn't operational, they would have been on. That night, the whispers came back, louder than ever. They seemed to surround me, filling every corner of the house. I tried playing music, turning on the TV, anything to drown them out, but nothing worked. And then I saw it, standing in the hallway, just out of the corner of my eye. The figure from the boat ride. Its long arms and shadowy face were unmistakable. It didn't move, but I could feel it watching me. I grabbed my car keys and ran out of the house, not even bothering to lock the door. I drove to a friend's place and stayed there for the night, but I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever this thing is, it's not tied to the park or the ride. It's tied to me. I live in a small town, and my job requires me to travel to a bigger city every week. It's about a 2-hour train ride each way, and I usually use that time to catch up on podcasts or read. On this particular evening, I had stayed late for a work meeting, so I ended up on the last train home. The train was nearly empty, save for a few other late-night commuters scattered across the cars. I picked a seat by the window in an empty section and settled in with my headphones. About 10 minutes into the ride, I noticed a man sitting a few rows ahead of me, facing the opposite direction. I hadn't seen him bored, and I was sure I'd chosen an empty car. He was wearing an old, tattered coat and a hat pulled low over his face. His clothes looked out of place, like they belonged to someone from another time. I tried to ignore him, chalking it up to my exhaustion, but something about him felt wrong. He wasn't moving, just sitting completely still, like a statue. About halfway through the ride, the train stopped at a station to let a few passengers off. When we started moving again, I glanced back to the man, but he was gone. I thought maybe he had gotten off without me noticing. Relieved, I put my headphones back on and leaned against the window. That's when I felt it, a presence. You know how you just know when someone is staring at you. Slowly, I turned my head, and there he was, sitting in the seat directly across the aisle from me. I froze. He hadn't made a sound, and there was no reason for him to move seats like that. His head was still tilted down, the brim of his hat hiding his face, but I could feel his eyes on me. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice shaky. No response. The train rattled on, the sound of the wheels on the tracks unnervingly loud in the silence. I didn't know what to do. My phone had no service, and the conductor wasn't anywhere nearby. I tried to ignore him, telling myself he was just a strange but harmless guy. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him slowly turn his head to face me. I looked directly at him for the first time, and my stomach dropped. His face, it wasn't right. His skin was ashen, his eyes sunken and hollow. He looked like a corpse, but his lips twitched into a slight grin when he saw my reaction. I jumped out of my seat and bolted toward the next car. I didn't look back until I reached the door, and when I did, he was standing in the aisle, watching me. Not running, just standing there, smiling. I ran through 2 more cars before I found a group of passengers. Gasping for breath, I told them what had happened. A man offered to go back with me to confront the guy, but when we returned to my car, it was empty. The only thing left behind was a single, worn-out train ticket on my seat. The date on it was from 1946. For weeks after that night, I couldn't shake the experience. It felt like a stain on my memory, one I couldn't scrub away no matter how hard I tried. I stopped commuting by train altogether, opting to drive instead. It was inconvenient and added time to my day, but the thought of stepping back onto that train sent shivers down my spine. But here's the thing, avoiding the train didn't stop the nightmares. Every night, I dreamed of that man. In my dreams, he was always sitting across from me, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. I could feel his eyes on me, though I never dared to look up. Sometimes, I'd hear his low, raspy breathing. Other times, he'd grin that awful grin, his lips curly like he knew something I didn't. One night, I woke up to find my bedroom freezing cold. It was the middle of summer, but the air was icy enough to make me see my breath. I thought my air conditioning had gone haywire, but when I reached for my phone to check the thermostat, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A worn-out train ticket was lying on my nightstand. I didn't touch it. I didn't want to believe it was real. Instead, I grabbed my keys and bolted out of my apartment, driving to a friend's house in the middle of the night. I stayed there for 2 days, too scared to go home. When I finally mustered the courage to return, the ticket was gone. I convinced myself it had been a nightmare. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing, stress piling up and playing tricks on me. But then, the incident started happening again. I'd catch glimpses of him in my peripheral vision, in the reflection of a shop window or a car mirror as I walked through parking lots. Always the same coat, the same hat pulled low. Each time I turned to look, he wasn't there, but the feeling lingered, that awful, gut-wrenching sense of being watched. It got worse when I started hearing him. Late at night, as I tried to sleep, I'd hear the faint sound of train wheels clattering on tracks. At first, it was so quiet I thought it was my imagination, but it grew louder as the nights went on. Then came the whispers, low, unintelligible murmurs, like someone sitting at the edge of my bed, muttering under their breath. I could never make out what he was saying, but the tone was cold and mocking, like he was laughing at me. The final straw came last week. I woke up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, the faint sound of train wheels echoing in my ears. My room was dark, except for a sliver of moonlight streaming through the window. As I sat up, trying to calm my breathing, I saw him. He was standing in the corner of my bedroom, his silhouette framed by the faint light. The hat, the coat, the faint glit of his teeth as he smiled. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I just sat there, frozen, as he slowly raised one hand and pointed at me. Then, without a sound, he disappeared. I don't know what he wants or why he's haunting me. I've tried looking into the history of the train line, but I haven't found anything that explains who or what he might be. All I know is that I can't escape him. No matter where I go, he follows. I started researching obsessively after that last encounter. If this thing wasn't going to leave me alone, I needed to understand what I was dealing with. I scoured forums, old news archives, and anything I could find about the train line, the ticket, and the strange figure I had encountered. Most of it was dead ends, urban legends about haunted stations, rumors about ghostly passengers. None of it felt real, and none of it matched my experience. Until I found the story. It was buried in an obscure blog about urban myths. The post was from 2011, and it described sightings of a shadowy man on the late train. The author claimed he always appeared in the last car, dressed in an old-fashioned coat and hat, his face obscured. Most accounts ended with the figure vanishing, but one story stood out. A woman claimed the man had followed her off the train and into her home. Days later, she disappeared without a trace. Her apartment had been locked from the inside, and the only thing left behind was a faded train ticket dated decades earlier. My stomach dropped. It sounded too similar to my own experience to dismiss, but the post offered no solutions, no explanation, just a warning: don't interact with it, don't look at it, don't acknowledge it. I wish I'd read that earlier. The encounters grew more frequent after I read that blog. I stopped sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt him standing there, watching. The whispers became louder, more distinct, though the words were still incomprehensible. My friends started noticing something was wrong. I was jumpy, pale, barely coherent, but I couldn't tell them who would believe me. Then came the night I truly thought it was over. I was driving home late after visiting my parents. The highway was nearly empty, just an endless stretch of dark asphalt lit by my headlights. I had my music on low, trying to keep myself calm, when I saw something ahead, a figure standing on the side of the road. As I approached, my heart sank. It was him. The hat, the coat, the impossible, empty face. He stood perfectly still, but as my car drew closer, he turned his head to look directly at me. I swerved instinctively, nearly losing control of the car. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, he was gone. I was shaky by the time I got home, but I couldn't sit in the driveway. I didn't feel safe anywhere. I locked myself in my house, every door and window bolted, and sat in the living room with every light on. My phone buzzed, and I jumped. It was a text from an unknown number. You can't run forever. I dropped the phone and backed away, heart pounding. Then I heard it, the sound of train wheels on tracks. But this time, it wasn't faint. It was deafening, like a freight train was barreling through my living room. I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out, because I woke up hours later on the floor. The lights were still on, and the house was silent. My phone was lying next to me, its screen cracked, the text thread gone. Since that night, things have been quiet. Too quiet. No whispers, no sightings, no train tickets mysteriously appearing. You think I'd feel relief, but I don't. I feel like it's not over, like he's waiting for something, waiting for me to let my guard down. To anyone reading this, if you ever see a man on a train and a coat and hat that seem out of place, don't interact with them. Don't look at him, and whatever you do, don't let him follow you. I've never told anyone because it sounds insane, but writing it down here feels like the right thing to do. I grew up in a quiet suburban neighborhood, one of those cookie-cutter developments where every street looks the same and every lawn has the same shrubs and mulch. At the center of the neighborhood was a small park with a playground, a few picnic tables, and a rusty metal swing set. It was the kind of place kids played during the day, but no one ever visited after dark. It started one summer evening when I was 16. My parents were out for the night, and my younger sister was at a sleepover. I was supposed to stay home and be responsible, but my best friend, Jenna, convinced me to meet her at the park for an hour. She said she had something important to tell me, and I didn't think twice about it. When I got there, Jenna was nowhere in sight. The park was eerily empty. The street lights along the road were on, but the ones near the playground flickered faintly or didn't work at all. I texted her, "Where are you?" No reply. I waited by the picnic tables for a few minutes, but the uneasy feeling in my stomach grew stronger. The air felt heavy. Then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic creaking. My eyes shifted toward the swing set, and that's when I saw her. A little girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, was sitting on one of the swings, gently swaying back and forth. She wore a white dress that seemed too clean, too perfect for the setting. Her head hung low, and her long dark hair covered her face. "Hey," I called out, trying to sound friendly. "Are you okay? Are you here alone?" She didn't answer. The creaking of the swing was the only sound. Something about her felt rugged. She wasn't swinging like a normal kid. It was more like she was being pushed, even though there was no one behind her. I stepped closer. That's when she stopped, dead still. Her head snapped up, and I froze. Her eyes, they weren't right. They were pitch black. No whites, no irises, just endless darkness. She tilted her head at an unnatural angle and said, in a voice that sounded far too deep for a child, "You shouldn't have come here." I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. What? The swing creaked again, but this time, she wasn't moving. The sound was coming from somewhere behind me. I whipped around and saw nothing but shadows. When I turned back, the girl was gone. I don't know how I made it home, but I sprinted the whole way, my lungs burning and my skin crawly. When I finally burst through the front door and locked it behind me, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Jenna. "Sorry, I can't make it. Felt grounded. Catch up tomorrow." For weeks after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I'd catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision or hear faint whispers when I was alone. At first, I thought it was paranoia, my brain playing tricks on me after the encounter at the park. But then things started happening around the house. It began with small, almost laughable incidents, lights flickering in my room, my alarm clock resetting itself, or the faint sound of creaking, like the swing set, outside my window at night. I told myself it was just faulty wiring or an overactive imagination. That all changed when I found the dirt. One morning, as I got ready for school, I noticed something odd on my bedroom floor. A trail of dirt and small twigs led from my window to my bed. The window was locked from the inside, and there were no signs of forced entry. My parents thought it was one of the neighborhood cats that had somehow found its way in, though they couldn't explain how it had locked the window behind itself. I tried to convince myself they were right, but deep down, I knew better. The next night, I decided to stay up late and keep watch. I left my bedroom light off and sat in bed, staring at the window. Then night came and went, and nothing happened. I started to feel silly, like I was overreacting. But then, at exactly 3:13 a.m., I heard the faint creak of a swing. It was so quiet at first that I thought it was in my head, but then it grew louder, clearer, as if it were coming closer. My chest tightened. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window. She was there, the girl from the park, standing in my backyard, staring up at me. Her black eyes glinted in the faint moonlight, and her head was tilted at that same unnatural angle. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. All I could do was stare back as she raised one pale hand and pointed directly at me. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Seconds, minutes, it felt like an eternity. Then she vanished, as if she had never been there at all. But when I finally gathered the courage to check the window the next morning, I found tiny, child-sized footprints in the dirt beneath it. After that night, I begged my parents to move. They thought I was being dramatic, blaming it on teenage angst or overactive imagination. But I didn't care. I stopped sleeping in my room altogether and started crashing on the couch in the living room. My grades slipped, and I withdrew from friends. Gina tried to talk to me about what was going on, but I couldn't find the words to explain it. How do you tell someone you're being haunted by a little girl who might not even be human? Eventually, my parents caved and decided to sell the house. The night before we moved, I had one last dream, or at least, I think it was a dream. I was back at the park, standing in front of the swing set. The girl was there, sitting on the swing, just like before. This time, she wasn't swaying. She was staring at me. "You can't run," she said, her voice echoing in my head. "I'll find you." I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. It's been years since that night, and I've moved twice since then, but I still sleep with the curtains drawn and a lamp on. Every now and then, I'll hear about strange things happening in that neighborhood. For a while, life seemed normal again. Moving to a new town gave me the fresh start I desperately needed. I started college, made new friends, and slowly pushed the memories of the girl by the swing set to the back of my mind. But deep down, I'd always felt a lingering sense of unease, like she was still out there, waiting. It wasn't until last year that I realized I hadn't escaped her. I had just moved into a small townhouse with my boyfriend, Nick. It was a cute place in a quiet neighborhood, far from the house I grew up in and even farther from that cursed park. Life was good. We were happy. Then, one evening, Nick came home holding a package. "Hey," he said, setting it on the counter. "This was on the porch for you." I frowned. I hadn't ordered anything. The box was small and unmarked, with no return address. My name was scrawled on the top in shaky, childlike handwriting. My stomach dropped. "What's wrong?" Nick asked, noticing the color drain from my face. "Probably nothing," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just some prank." I opened the box, my hands trembling. Inside was a single object, a tiny swing made of twigs and string. It looked exactly like the swing set from the park. Beneath it was a scrap of paper with 4 words scrawled in the same shaky handwriting. "I told you so." I couldn't breathe. My hand shook as I shoved the box away, sending it clattering to the floor. Nick picked it up, looking puzzled. "What is this?" he asked. "Did someone send you a weird craft project?" "I don't know." I lied. "Probably some mistake." But I did know. I knew exactly who it was from. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house made my heart race. Every shadow seemed to stretch and move in unnatural ways. At 3:13 a.m., the time I dreaded most, I heard it again. The creak of a swing. It wasn't outside this time. It was in the house. I woke Nick, panicking, but he insisted it was nothing. "It's an old house," he said. "Probably just the floorboard settling." I didn't argue, but I stayed awake, listening. The sound didn't stop until sunrise. Over the next few days, more things started happening. I'd wake up to find dirt on the floor, tiny footprints leading from the front door to our bedroom. Lights flickered constantly, and Nick's usually calm demeanor began to change. He grew irritable, distant, like something was eating away at him. One night, I found him sitting in the living room, staring at the little twig swing. "She's watching us," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who?" I asked. confused, even though I already knew. The girl, he replied, his eyes glassy and unfocused. She says it's your fault. I grabbed the swing and threw it in the fireplace, watching as the flames consumed it. But even as it burned, I swear I heard her voice, low and guttural, like nails scraping on metal. You can't escape me. That night, Nick left the house without a word and never came back. His car was found abandoned a few miles away, but there was no sign of him. The police said he probably just needed space, but I knew better. She had taken him. I moved out the next day, leaving everything behind. I haven't stopped moving since. I never stay in one place for too long, and I avoid parks like the plague, but no matter where I go, I can't escape her. Last week, I got another package. Inside was another twig swing, charred at the edges. This time, the note was shorter. See you soon. I've always loved working at the antique store in my small town. There's something about the stories behind old objects that fascinated me. It's a quiet job, and most of my time is spent cataloging items or helping the occasional customer find the perfect quirky piece for their home. But after what happened last month, I can't step foot in there again. It was a late Friday evening, and I was closing up alone. My boss had left early, trusting me to lock up. The store is quaint, filled to the brim with everything from dusty old books to mismatched china sets and eerie porcelain dolls. As I went through the usual routine, turning off the lights in each section, securing the back door, and double checking the register if something fell off. The store always had a quiet hum from the street lights outside and the faint creak of the old wooden floorboards. That night, it was different. It was too quiet. Even the hum seemed to fade, replaced by a kind of static, like white noise. While locking the display cabinet near the front of the store, I noticed something in the reflection of the glass, a shadow moving near the back. My first instinct was that someone had stayed behind after closing, maybe a customer who didn't realize we were closing up. Hello, I called out, my voice shaking slightly. No response. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, walking cautiously toward the back. As I passed rows of antique furniture and shelves of trinkets, the air grew colder. By the time I reached the back corner, I could see my breath in the air. Is someone there? I tried again, louder this time. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping noise, like fingernails on glass. It came from an old grandfather clock we had just received earlier that week. It was a beautiful piece, intricate carvings, and a pendulum that didn't move because it was broken. The tapping continued. My flashlight illuminated the glass face of the clock. I expected to see something harmless, a rat or some loose mechanism causing the sound, but instead, I saw a face. It was pressed against the glass, pale and contorted in a way that didn't seem possible. The eyes were sunken, yet they locked onto mine with a kind of malice I can't describe. The lips twisted into a grin that stretched too far, showing jagged teeth that didn't belong in a human mouth. My body froze. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The face inside the clock tilted slightly, and I swear I saw its lips move. It whispered something, though I couldn't understand the words. Then, the tapping stopped, and the pendulum swung. I bolted out of the store, leaving the lights, doors, and everything else. I didn't care. I just ran. The next day, my boss called me, furious that I had it locked up. I didn't tell her what I saw. How could I? I just muttered an apology and quit on the spot. A few days later, I passed by the store. It was closed, with a sign on the door saying, under new management. I didn't think much of it until I heard from a coworker that my boss was missing. The police found her car outside the store, but there was no sign of her, just her shoes neatly placed in front of the grandfather clock. A week after quitting, I still couldn't shake the memory of that face in the clock. My nights were restless, filled with dreams where the distorted figure crawled out of the glass, its two long fingers reaching for me. I tried to convince myself it was stress or some bizarre trick of the light, but deep down, I knew what I saw was real. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that there was something more to that clock. I started researching antique clocks online, hoping to find anything that could explain what I saw. After hours of scrolling through forums and obscure collector websites, I stumbled across an old post on a defunct blog. It was written by someone who claimed to have owned a clock that sounded eerily similar to the one in the store. According to the post, the clock was cursed or haunted, as the writer put it. They mentioned seeing strange faces in the glass, hearing whispers in languages they didn't understand, and experiencing a deep, unshakable dread whenever they were near it. The post ended abruptly, with the writer warning readers to stay away. There were no follow-ups. Against my better judgment, I decided to go back to the store. It had been a week since I left, and I told myself I just needed closure. I wasn't planning on going inside, just driving by to see if the clock was still there. Maybe if I saw it through the window, I could convince myself it was just an ordinary object, and the terror I felt was all in my head. When I pulled up to the store, my stomach dropped. The lights inside were on, but the under new management sign had been replaced with a simple closed notice. I parked across the street, doorway, debating whether to go closer when I saw movement inside. A figure was pacing back and forth, their shadow flickering in the light. It was hard to make out who it was, but they seemed agitated, their movements sharp and frantic. I watched as they stopped in front of the grandfather clock, staring at it for what felt like forever. Then they reached out and placed their hand on the glass. I don't know what I expected to happen, but it wasn't this. The person's body jerked violently like they'd been electrocuted. Their head snapped back, and they let out a soundless scream. Before I could react, they collapsed to the floor, and the lights in the store went out. I should have called the police. I should have driven away, but something compelled me to stay. Against every instinct, I crossed the street and peered through the window. The store was pitch dark, but my eyes slowly adjusted. The person was still on the ground, motionless, but the clock was glowing faintly, an unnatural, sickly green light emanating from the glass. And then I saw it. The face. It was clearer than ever, pressed against the glass, grinning at me. Only this time, it wasn't alone. Behind it, more faces began to emerge, their expressions twisted in agony and rage. The glass rippled like water, and I swear I heard them whispering my name. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and ran to my car. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. For a split second, I saw the face in the backseat, grinning that impossibly wide grin. I've moved to a different town now, far away from that store and that clock. But some nights, I still hear the tapping on my bedroom window, on my bathroom mirror, on the glass of my phone screen. A month passed, and I started to feel like I might be safe. The tapping on glass had become less frequent, and I began to convince myself it was all just in my head. Trauma plays tricks on the mind, right? That's what I told myself. But then, 2 nights ago, something happened that I can't explain away. I was unpacking groceries at my tiny new kitchen. It was late, and the only sounds were the hum of the fridge and the occasional car passing outside. As I reached for a glass from the cabinet, my phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text from an unknown number. "Do you remember me?" My heart sank. It could have been spam, but something about it felt off. Before I could respond or block the number, another message came through, this time with a photo. It was a picture of the grandfather clock. The glass was cracked, and faintly, I could make out the gritty face in the reflection. I dropped the phone, my hands trembling. When I picked it up again, the message thread was gone. No trace of the number, no photo, nothing. I didn't sleep at night. I kept all the lights on and sat in the middle of the living room, clutching a kitchen knife, as if that could protect me from whatever was happening. But nothing came. No tapping, no whispers, no strange faces. By the next morning, I was exhausted but determined. I decided to find out where the clock was now. I had to know if someone else had taken it, if someone else was experiencing what I did. Maybe I wasn't the only one. I drove to the antique store, but when I arrived, it was boarded up. A for lease sign hung crookedly on the door. The windows were covered, but through a small gap, I could see that the place had been gutted. All the antiques were gone, and the store was empty, except for the clock. It stood in the middle of the bare room, like it had always been there. The glass was cracked just like in the photo, but the face was gone. As I stared at it, I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. The air around me grew heavier, almost suffocating. Then I felt it. A tap, not on the glass this time, but on my shoulder. I spun around, but no one was there. The street was empty. When I turned back to the window, the clock was gone. I ran to my car and drove straight home, my mind racing. I thought I was losing it. Maybe I already had. But when I got home, something was waiting for me. The clock. It was standing in my living room, right in the middle of the rug. I don't know how it got there. The front door was locked, the windows were shut, and I lived alone. But there it was, as real as the air I was struggling to breathe. The face was back, but it was different this time. It wasn't grinning. It was staring at me with empty, hollow eyes, and its lips moved silently, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. "It's your turn." The clock began to tick. The pendulum swung faster and faster as the face pressed harder against the glass. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The whisper started again, louder now, filling my ears with a language that made my head ache. I don't remember much after that. I woke up hours later on the floor. The clock was gone, but my apartment felt rug. The mirrors seemed to ripple when I walked past them, and the glass in my windows felt warm to the touch. Now, every night, I hear the ticking. It's faint, but it's there, like a heartbeat in the walls. I know it's not over. The clock is waiting, watching, somewhere just out of sight. If you ever come across an antique grandfather clock with a cracked face and a broken pendulum, don't touch it. Don't even look at it. Alright, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But as always,
Have a nice day.